Some marriages do not end because of one catastrophic explosion. They crumble quietly because one person grows accustomed to wielding the word divorce like a blunt weapon to force the other into submission. For years, I was the woman whose heart seized up every time her husband uttered that word. I would think of our children, of our family, of what our neighbors and church community in our suburban Connecticut town might say, and I would whisper to myself, just take a step back. Keep the peace under this roof. Yet on that brisk autumn evening, after more than 20 years of marriage, I was the calmest person in the room. My husband, Julian, sat at the head of the dark walnut dining table. Before him lay a stack of legal documents turned to the final page. He gripped his fountain pen, scrawled his signature with an aggressive flourish, and shoved the papers across the table toward me. There, it is done. Are you satisfied now? Julian's voice was arctic, his chin tilted up with that familiar arrogance, entirely convinced he still held every card in the deck. His mother, Miriam, sat right beside him on the upholstered dining chair. She looked me up and down with narrowed eyes, letting out a sharp, dismissive scoff. A woman pushing 50, throwing tantrums over her pride. As if the outside world is going to roll out a red carpet for you. Give it a couple of weeks, and you will come crawling back on your knees with nowhere else to turn. I did not offer a single word in defense. Seeing my silence, Miriam seemed convinced that fear had finally gripped my throat. Julian leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms over his tailored vest. I did not force your hand, Corinne. You are the one who wanted to blow this out of proportion. Now that it is signed, we live separate lives. When are you packing your boxes and moving out? I raised my eyes and met his gaze evenly. Packing what? Julian let out a dry, incredulous laugh. Your things, obviously. What else? You do not honestly expect to keep living here after a divorce, do you? I looked at the man across from me. He still had that habit of barking every syllable as if volume alone could fabricate truth. The only difference was that, this time, the icy knot in my stomach was gone. I reached down beside my chair and lifted my brown leather briefcase. The metallic click of the brass latch sounded unusually crisp in the quiet room. From within, I drew a slender blue folder and placed it squarely on the polished wood. I am not moving anywhere. The smirk on Julian's face vanished instantly. Excuse me? What did you just say? I said that the person who needs to arrange new living accommodations is not me. Miriam burst out laughing, shrill and incredulous. Good heavens, are you actually trying to kick your own husband out of his home? Get a grip on reality, Corinne. I turned calmly toward her. You might want to read the deed before you speak, Miriam. Julian snatched the folder across the table. He flipped through the initial pages and froze when his eyes landed on the property deed, the title history, and the premarital deed of gift executed by my parents before our wedding. Julian knew where this house had come from. But there are truths people know deep down. Yet because no one challenges them for decades, they gradually convince themselves they have the right to erase them. He jerked his head up, his eyes blazing. How long have you been preparing this behind my back? Long enough to know exactly what I am doing, I answered steadily. You have been scheming against me? No. I have simply been preparing for the exact outcome you kept demanding. Julian slammed the papers onto the tabletop. I have lived under this roof for over 20 years. I paid for renovations. I built the backstone patio. My 2 children grew up in these bedrooms. And now you pull out a few sheets of paper and tell me to pack my bags? I never claimed you made no contributions, I replied softly. Then what on earth do you call this? Whatever needs to be accounted for will be accounted for. Whatever requires a financial offset for marital appreciation or physical improvements will be resolved equitably in the settlement, but do not confuse financial contribution with sole ownership. Julian brought his open palm down hard on the table. Where did you learn to speak to me like this? I remained seated, hands resting loosely in my lap. I did not learn it from anyone. It is simply that in the past, I used to choke back my words halfway through a sentence, because I was terrified of your temper. Miriam cut in sharply, her voice trembling with indignation. Listen to yourself. All these years my son provided for this household, and now you talk as if he were nothing more than a tenant in a boarding house. I never considered Julian a tenant, I said, looking her directly in the eye. However, when 2 people no longer live together as husband and wife, Housing arrangements must be settled clearly according to the law of property. Miriam's face flushed crimson. This is my son's house! I held her gaze for several long seconds before speaking. Miriam, you have lived here for over 4 years. I have never once counted a single meal I cooked for you, nor a single prescription I picked up at the pharmacy on my way home from work. I wanted you to be comfortable in your retirement, but being welcomed into someone's home as family is very different from claiming their separate property as your own. Enough! Julian snapped, standing up so violently that his chair screeched against the hardwood floor. Do you think having your name on a premarital title means you win? I stood up as well, keeping my voice low and level. I have no desire to win against you, Julian. Then what do you want? I want everything that belongs to each person to return to its rightful place from this day forward. Julian sneered. Someone put you up to this, did they not? Who fed you these lines? I did not answer. Inside my mind, an echo from the past replayed itself, a phrase I had heard so many times it was etched into my memory. I drew a slow, deliberate breath. Do you remember what you shouted at me the night my mother was here? Julian frowned, his jaw tightening. What are you talking about? Get the hell out of this house and let us see how many days you survive on your own. Miriam abruptly looked away toward the bay window. Julian went completely rigid. I knew he remembered. I raised my hand and pointed calmly toward the front entrance. Tonight, I am returning those exact words to you. You need to make other arrangements. This is my house. Miriam shot out of her seat. Do not push your luck, Corinne. You have gone entirely too far. I turned to her. I am not throwing Julian's luggage onto the lawn, nor am I changing the deadbolts tonight. Everything will be handled strictly according to the legal timeline we agree upon. He will have a full 30 days to secure an apartment. Julian gritted his teeth, his voice a low hiss. You think speaking in a soft voice makes you righteous? No. What is fair and lawful has never depended on who shouts the loudest. At that moment, our 22-year-old son Wesley stepped into the archway of the living room, his posture tense and uneasy. Behind him stood our 19-year-old daughter Kendra, her eyes rimmed with red. I looked at our children with tenderness. Wesley, Kendra, neither of you needs to choose a side. This is between your father and me, and we will handle it like adults. Julian swung around to his son. Wesley, did you hear how your mother is speaking to me? Wesley stood silent for a long moment before answering quietly. I heard. Dad. Miriam looked at her grandchildren, her hands fluttering with agitation. You two need to talk some sense into your mother. Please do not drag the children into this, Miriam. I interrupted firmly. She turned on me, her hands shaking with rage. You have completely changed. You are not the woman who married my son. I offered a faint, sorrowful smile. No, Miriam. Perhaps I have simply stopped pretending that I can bear this any longer. Julian turned toward the patio doors, reached into his jacket pocket for his keys, and then shoved them back inside. That small, habitual gesture reminded me that we had shared a life for a very long time. We had hosted Thanksgiving dinners together. We had stayed awake through the night, taking turns holding the children when they had fevers. I did not deny those shared years. But a home cannot stand on memories alone. It requires mutual respect to hold up its beams. Julian turned back, his jaw set. Have you truly thought this through? I have. And I have no regrets. I looked straight into his eyes. The only thing I truly regret is allowing myself to live in terror of a single threat for far too long. Miriam let out a heavy, bitter breath. Give someone an inch and they take a mile. I clicked my briefcase shut. No one in that room knew the grueling emotional road I had walked to arrive at that level of composure. There had been so many nights when I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering what would be left of my identity if I ever stepped out of this marriage. Before I set those documents on the table, I had been a woman who feared the destruction of her family more than anything else in this world. My name is Corinne, though everyone has called me Cora for as long as I can remember. If one wants to understand how a wife who once rushed to apologize the moment her husband brought up divorce could eventually stand tall in her own living room and tell him to pack his bags, one must go back to the beginning. Julian was not a suffocating man from day one. And I did not realize back then that the boundary between a decisive, capable man and a man who demands the entire household bow to his will is often paved by the countless times a wife chooses silence just to keep the peace. More than 20 years ago, I met Julian at a mutual friend's wedding reception in suburban Connecticut. Back then, he had a stable career in corporate logistics, carried himself with mature confidence, and took charge of any situation with ease. While other young men hesitated, Julian rolled up his sleeves, coordinated the catering staff, and arranged the reception hall flawlessly. I remember thinking to myself that a man with such initiative would surely know how to look after a family. He was 3 years older than me. He was never one for flowery poetry or extravagant romantic gestures, but whenever I faced an obstacle, he showed up. When my car had a flat tire on Interstate 95, Julian drove out to change it. When my mother suffered from severe back pain, he offered to drive us to the specialist clinic in New Haven. When my family hosted 4th of July cookouts, he arrived early, helped my father set up tables in the yard, and greeted our relatives with polished respect. My father once told me, "Julian is a capable man. Cora, you can tell a man's character by whether he steps up when there is work to be done rather than hiding in the corner." Hearing my father's approval made me feel even more secure. In those youthful days, what I mistook for inner strength was simply Julian's domineering decisiveness. I had no idea that the very trait I admired would gradually mutate from someone who liked solving problems into someone who believed he alone had the right to dictate how our lives were run. Before our wedding, my parents deeded a charming 2-story colonial home on a quiet cul-de-sac in Fairfield County exclusively to my name. The house was not brand new. Its cedar siding had weathered slightly, and the front yard had just enough space for a small porch and some potted hydrangeas. But to me, it was an immense blessing. My father had said, "Your mother and I have 2 daughters. Giving you a secure roof over your head gives us peace of mind. Later on, when you are married, having your own property means you will never have to walk on eggshells or endure anyone's condescension." I had laughed and teased him. "Dad, you worry too much. I am getting married, not heading onto a battlefield." My father had simply shaken his head gently. "Take the deed, Cora. There are things in life that seem unnecessary during peaceful times, but when storms arrive, you realize their true value." The day I brought Julian to see the house, he walked through every room, looked out at the backyard, and said, "Your home will be the foundation of our life together. It does not matter whose name is on the title deed. What matters is that we treat each other with kindness and build a decent marriage." Those words touched my heart deeply. After our wedding, Julian moved in with me. In the early years, our life was not difficult. Our income was modest, but we managed our finances sensibly. We both worked hard, and in the evenings we cooked simple dinners, roast chicken, steamed vegetables, and baked potatoes, and sat talking at the kitchen island until late at night. When Wesley was born, Julian was so overjoyed that he bought an excess of baby supplies, half of which a newborn could not possibly use. I looked at the towering cardboard boxes in the hallway and laughed. At this rate, our son will still be using these diapers in middle school. Julian rubbed the back of his neck, grinning. "It is my first time being a father. Everything looks essential." 3 years later, Kendra arrived, and the household grew even busier. Julian would come home from work, take the baby in his arms, and warm up bottles without complaint. He was not an absentee or irresponsible father. It was precisely because we had shared those warm, tender years that it took me so long to accept that the man I loved had fundamentally changed. In truth, Julian did not transform overnight. It began with tiny, seemingly inconsequential decisions. When the kitchen needed remodeling, he insisted, "Let me handle the general contractors. You do not know anything about town building permits or cabinetry." I agreed. When it came time to choose preschools, Julian said, "I have done the research. The private academy on the north side of town is far better." I went along with it. When we bought our first family sport utility vehicle, he compared prices, consulted his colleagues, and finalized the purchase. His choices seemed reasonable, so I never raised an objection. Gradually, I grew accustomed to letting Julian make every final call. Back then, I believed that being a good wife meant yielding a little to maintain harmony. I forgot that an authentic marriage requires 2 equal minds, not one person giving orders while the other nods along. At first, Julian would ask, "What do you think, Cora?" Over time, that question became rare, replaced by, I have already figured it out, which eventually turned into, I have already made the decision. I once gently suggested, you could ask for my thoughts before finalizing things. Julian would chuckle dismissively. At the end of the day, someone has to make the executive call. If two people argue over every little detail, nothing ever gets done. It sounded practical enough, so I let it slide. Once, I wanted to paint the living room in a warm, airy linen tone. Julian disliked it. He called the painters and selected a cool slate gray without telling me. When I came home from work and saw the walls nearly finished, I asked, "You decided on your own?" Julian replied casually, "Yes. The color you picked gets smudged too easily. This looks far more sophisticated." I felt a pang of frustration, but I told myself it was merely paint on drywall. Another time, I planned to replace the sagging dresser in Kendra's bedroom. Julian declared it unnecessary. When I pointed out that repairing it would cost nearly as much as buying a solid wooden piece from the local furniture showroom, he waved his hand dismissively. I said it is not necessary, and that is that. That was the first time I felt a true chill. It was not about the dresser. It was the chilling realization that my perspective was no longer considered a valid factor in any household equation. Yet, 10 minutes later, Julian walked into the room carrying a mug of hot chamomile tea, asking if I wanted some. Looking at the husband who still remembered how I took my tea, I rationalized his behavior. He is just blunt. He does not mean any harm. Women are often exceptionally skilled at inventing excuses to forgive the men they love. Then, the way Julian referred to our home began to shift through subtle phrasing. During our first few years, he would often say, "Your house is so convenient to the train station." After we jointly spent money updating the kitchen cabinets, replacing the patio slider, and remodeling the upstairs bathroom, his phrasing shifted to our house. I was happy to hear that. Our house sounded warm, as if we had truly woven our lives into a unified whole. However, without me noticing when it began, Julian started telling his friends and coworkers, "Come over to my place in Fairfield, or I am hosting a barbecue at my house." I never corrected him in public. To me, quibbling over my house versus your house between spouses felt petty and cold. One Saturday evening, Julian invited several colleagues over for dinner. As I brought out the roasted pork tenderloin and salad, one of his coworkers joked, "Julian, you have got a gorgeous, spacious place here. Your wife must have it easy." Julian laughed heartily, booming across the dining table. "Well, under my roof, as long as people follow my rules, life is wonderful." The guests laughed along. I managed a polite smile, but the serving tongs in my hand froze. That was the first time I heard Julian openly proclaim in front of outsiders that everyone had to follow his rules under his roof. After the guests departed and the front door closed, I asked him as I cleared the wine glasses, "Were you just joking earlier?" Julian, scrolling through his smartphone on the sofa, did not even look up. "About what?" "About this being your house, and everyone having to follow your rules." He chuckled. "You are seriously taking offense to a harmless joke?" I remained silent. He added, "Besides, am I wrong? A home needs a head of the household to keep things orderly." I stared at him, wanting to ask what my role was in this house if he was the sole ruler, but the words withered on my tongue. The children were young, I had an early morning shift at work, and the kitchen sink was piled with dishes. I told myself it was not worth starting a midnight argument. Looking back, I realized that small warning signs are never truly insignificant. A person does not become an authoritarian overnight. They advance inch by inch. And if the person beside them retreats step by step to avoid conflict, they will wake up one day to find their back pressed firmly against the edge of a cliff. Back then, I did not see it. I genuinely believed I was protecting my family's stability. Meanwhile, Julian began to believe that my silence signified complete consent. After my father-in-law passed away, Miriam lived alone for a while in her suburban home in upstate New York. Julian loved his mother deeply. He called her every Sunday and drove up once a month to check on her. One evening, he said to me, "I am thinking of having my mother move in with us. She is rattling around that big house alone, and it makes more sense for her to be here." In contemporary American life, having an aging parent move into the family home is a major transition, often requiring clear boundaries and shared caregiving responsibilities. I was chopping vegetables at the island counter. I paused and asked, "Does she want to downsize and relocate?" She was hesitant at first, but she is getting older and I do not feel comfortable with her living 3 hours away. I nodded without hesitation. Then, let us prepare the second-floor guest suite for her. Julian looked at me, mildly surprised. You do not mind? I smiled. Your mother is family. She is on her own now. It is better for her to be close to her son and grandchildren. I meant every word. Before Miriam arrived, I deep-cleaned the bedroom, bought a plush orthopedic mattress, and purchased a low nightstand so she would not have to strain her back reaching for her reading glasses. In the adjoining bathroom, I hired a handyman to install sturdy stainless steel grab bars near the walk-in shower and toilet so she would not slip. When Miriam arrived and saw the preparations, she seemed touched. Cora, you did not have to spend so much money on all this fuss. It is nothing, Miriam, I replied warmly, as long as it makes your daily routine comfortable. During the first few months, our coexistence was remarkably peaceful. A neighbor from across the street once stopped by while I was carrying groceries into the kitchen, remarking on what a supportive daughter-in-law I was for welcoming Julian's mother into our home. Miriam beamed with pride, saying, "Yes, Cora keeps everything running smoothly." Hearing that warmed my heart. I had always believed that when sharing a home with an in-law, the most precious quality was not asserting dominance, but recognizing each other's good intentions. Unfortunately, that recognition came with a rigid, unspoken condition. I had to be the one who always yielded. Miriam came from a generation and background where traditional, rigid gender roles were treated as sacred law, and she brought those outdated expectations right into our modern household. On mornings when I left early for work, Miriam would sometimes wake up before me and pack a small container of fresh fruit and a hard-boiled egg for my commute, telling me not to skip breakfast. In return, I kept careful track of her blood pressure medications, ordering refills well before the bottles ran out and driving her to her cardiology appointments. During those moments, I considered myself fortunate, yet I soon discovered that Miriam operated on an unshakable premise. Whenever friction arose between Julian and me, the person expected to back down was always me. The first time this became glaringly apparent was on a Tuesday evening. I was delayed at my office due to an urgent inventory supply chain issue. I called ahead to let the family know, but traffic on the highway was backed up, making dinner later than usual. When Julian walked through the door and saw the dining table bare, his face clouded over. "Is dinner not ready yet? What is going on?" Setting my handbag down, I explained, "I called earlier to let you know. I am starting on it right now." Miriam walked out of her room. I assumed she would tell her son to be patient for a few minutes. Instead, she turned to me with a frown. "Cora, you know Julian comes home hungry after working all day at the firm. You should manage your work schedule better." I stood frozen for a second. "Miriam, something unexpected came up at work. Besides, Julian knows how to heat up soup or make a sandwich if he is hungry." Miriam's brow furrowed deeper. A man works hard all day. If he has to come home and fix his own food, what is the point of having a wife? The words hit me like a physical blow. Julian sat down at the table, offering no defense on my behalf, merely adding, "My mother is not wrong." I did not argue. I washed my hands and cooked dinner in silence. But from that evening on, I noticed that whenever Julian was irritable, Miriam reflexively sought the fault in me. If Julian came home brooding, she would whisper to me, "Just give in to him a little, Cora. Men need their pride stroked." I once asked half-jokingly, "Miriam, why is it always me who has to give in? Does Julian never need to compromise for me?" Miriam replied as if stating an immutable law of nature. "Men have fiery tempers, but it passes quickly. A woman needs to be soft to keep a household peaceful. But if one person is always soft, the other person only grows harder and more demanding," I pointed out. She waved her hand dismissively. "You modern women overanalyze everything. In my day, being a wife was about endurance." She would then recount how her mother-in-law had run the entire household with an iron fist, and how she had never dared speak back. I listened with a mixture of sympathy and sadness. I used to think people who endured hardship would naturally empathize with others, but some people derive a different conclusion. Because I had to swallow my voice, the person who comes after me must endure it as well. Julian soon realized his mother was his permanent ally. In the past, during our disagreements, he at least had to defend his reasoning. After Miriam moved in, a mere scowl from him was enough to bring her rushing to his defense. One weekend, Julian insisted the entire family drive out to his extended family's annual gathering in Rhode Island. However, I had already scheduled an important specialist medical checkup for my own mother, Beatrice, on that exact Saturday. I suggested that Julian take Wesley and Kendra to Rhode Island, and I would join them later in the afternoon if time permitted. Julian frowned. It looks terrible if my wife is missing from our family gathering. I made this appointment for my mother weeks ago, I explained. She lives alone and has no one else to drive her into the city clinic. Miriam, folding laundry nearby, chimed in. Your mother's appointment can be rescheduled for another day, Cora. A family reunion only happens once a year. I turned to her. Miriam, this is a specialist appointment at the hospital clinic. You cannot simply reschedule on a whim. Miriam sighed dramatically. Then, explain it to your mother. Once a woman is married, she needs to know which family takes priority. I looked at Julian. He said nothing more, calmly sipping his coffee as if his mother had successfully settled the matter on his behalf. In the end, I still took my mother to her doctor. But Julian gave me the cold shoulder for days, while Miriam dropped passive-aggressive remarks about how a woman who keeps one foot in her maternal home can never build a peaceful marriage. What wounded me was not merely that she sided with her son. It was the fundamental belief that I was never his equal. If Julian was angry, I was expected to soothe him. If I was hurt, I was expected to swallow it. If his mother needed assistance, I had to drop everything. If my mother needed help, I had to ensure it did not inconvenience his household. The scale tipped steadily, almost imperceptibly. One night, after everyone had gone upstairs, I stayed in the kitchen finishing the dishes. On the stairs, I overheard Miriam speaking to Julian in hushed tones. A wife must be trained gradually, son. If you pamper her too much, she will become unmanageable. My hands, holding a porcelain bowl under the running water, froze. Unmanageable. The word sounded so casual, yet I was his wife, an equal adult partner with an executive career, not a disobedient child to be trained. Standing by the sink, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, a stark realization washed over me. Since my mother-in-law moved in, our household had gained only one person. Yet in every conflict, I was facing a united front of two against one. And the most terrifying part was that I continued telling myself, just endure it a little longer to keep the peace. After hearing that word on the staircase, I began paying closer attention to how Julian spoke to me. I had previously chalked up his outburst to a hot temper, assuming he blew off steam and forgot about it. But, looking closely, I realized there was a specific phrase he used with calculated frequency, and every single time he used it, I was the one who surrendered. Those two words were, get divorced. The very first time Julian weaponized that phrase was during a heated argument years earlier when Wesley was in elementary school and Kendra had just started kindergarten. We were debating whether to take out a substantial auto loan to upgrade to a luxury European vehicle. I felt our current reliable sedan was perfectly fine and wanted to maintain a robust emergency savings fund for the children's college education. Julian wanted the luxury car, arguing that our current vehicle looked modest among our peers at the country club. We do not need to spend that money right now, I said gently. We can wait 6 months. Julian scowled. You are always terrified of everything. I am not terrified, Julian. I am being financially prudent. He slammed his hand on the table. If we cannot agree on how to live our lives, then let us just get a divorce and be done with it. My breath caught in my chest. Back then, the word divorce felt like a catastrophic earthquake. I did not think about assets or legalities. My immediate panic was for our 2 young children, what our families would say, and how our suburban community would view a broken home. That night, despite knowing my financial reasoning was sound, I was the one who softened my tone. Look, if you truly think it is necessary, we can revisit the monthly budget. Julian never apologized for throwing the threat of divorce in my face. He simply fell silent. And that was the moment he learned its immense power. A threat that succeeds on its first deployment quickly becomes a reliable weapon. The second time occurred when we discussed replacing the living room furniture. The existing set was solid oak, just slightly worn. Julian wanted an expensive, imported leather sectional to impress guests. I suggested the funds would be better spent repairing the roof shingles before winter. He gave me a cold look. You only know how to pinch pennies over trivial nonsense. Being frugal is not being stingy, Julian. He leaned back, his tone deceptively calm. If our lifestyles are incompatible, we can live separately. I am not forcing you to stay. He did not raise his voice, but the calculated indifference chilled me to the bone. Once again, I backed down. The leather sectional arrived 5 days later. Miriam praised her son, saying, "A man needs to make firm executive decisions. Asking permission for every little thing gets you nowhere." Another time, my mother took a bad fall at her home in rural, upstate New York. She did not break any bones, but her lower back was severely bruised. I wanted to stay with her for 2 full days to help her with groceries and monitor her recovery. I informed Julian in advance. He was instantly displeased. 2 full days? Yes. She lives alone, Julian. Who else is going to look after her? Julian set his glass down hard on the counter. I have clients coming over tomorrow evening. Who is going to host them with me? I prepared the food in advance. Everything is in the refrigerator. His eyes narrowed. If your mother's house is that important to you, why do you not just pack up and move back there permanently? I looked at him in disbelief. How can you say something so cruel? Cruel? I am being honest. You always prioritize your side of the family. Before I could reply, Miriam stepped out of her bedroom. After listening for a moment, she chimed in, "Cora, you can visit for an afternoon. Your mother has a bruise, not a terminal condition." A married woman must remember where her primary home is. Primary home. The phrase choked me. Yet, terrified of another ultimatum, I stayed only one afternoon. When my mother asked, "Can you stay the night, Cora?" I forced a bright smile and lied. "I have an early morning corporate meeting, Mom." I lied to my own mother because I was terrified that staying would trigger Julian's favorite threat. The third major incident occurred when my employer selected me to lead a 4-day regional corporate catering and operations conference in Philadelphia. As the director of operations, my presence was mandatory. When I told Julian, he snapped. "Can they not send someone else?" "No. I am heading the entire regional project." Julian's voice turned icy. "There are 100 things that need attention at home. If you leave, who manages the household?" "I have arranged everything. Gretchen is coming in to clean, and the meals are planned." Julian stared at me with contempt. "If your career is more important than your husband, we might as well sign the divorce papers right now." He pulled a blank sheet of paper from the printer, slapped it onto the table and said, "Go on. If you crave freedom that badly, write out the dissolution petition." I did not write it, nor did I attend the conference. My regional vice president had to replace me at the 11th hour, and I received a formal reprimand for the sudden cancellation. That evening, Julian ate his dinner casually, as if nothing had transpired. When I asked, "Do you realize how unfair that was?" he merely shrugged. "I just wanted you to understand what truly matters. And if I had refused to cancel, would you have genuinely divorced me?" He did not look at me. "Do not push me to prove it." That remark deepened my invisible prison. I realized there was a perpetual balance scale in my mind. On one side was my personal dignity and professional desires. On the other was the survival of my marriage. And every single time, I voluntarily reduced my own worth to keep the scale from tipping into divorce. Miriam saw nothing wrong with Julian's behavior. When I once confided in her, "Miriam, it exhausts me how Julian brings up divorce over every minor disagreement," she simply peeled an orange and replied, "He is just blowing off steam, Cora." A man only threatens when he wants his wife to improve. If he were truly done with you, he would pack his bags and vanish without a word. I did not know whether to laugh or weep. In my mother-in-law's eyes, emotional intimidation was somehow a bizarre expression of care. From then on, Julian rarely needed to raise his voice. Whenever I voiced a differing opinion, he would sit calmly and say, "If you find living with me so unbearable, Cora, we can end it." Or, "If we cannot see eye to eye, let us split up." He would even say in front of his mother, "I have said it before. Whoever can tolerate my way of life stays." And Miriam would turn to me. "Did you hear that?" Since he put it so clearly, "Stop being so stubborn." Sentence by sentence, I was conditioned to live by reflex. constantly maneuvering to avoid displeasing Julian. When shopping for groceries, I calculated what he preferred. When visiting my mother, I watched the clock obsessively. When unexpected tasks arose at work, I felt a surge of anxiety, wondering how to frame the explanation so he would not erupt. I called it compromise. Only much later did I realize that compromise is when two partners mutually adjust to build a shared life. When one person continually diminishes themselves to avoid abandonment, that is simply fear. The most tragic part was that I had inadvertently trained Julian to know that his tactic worked. He mentioned divorce, and I retreated. He threatened separation, and I yielded. He went cold, and I initiated the apology. With every surrender, the authority under our roof tilted further into his grasp. Until one evening, Julian did not even need an argument. He merely set his fork down, looked across the table, and said casually, "If being married to me is such a burden, Cora, let us get a divorce." His tone was as light as asking if I wanted more iced tea. And though I had heard those words dozens of times, my heart still plummeted. I had not yet realized that the most dangerous aspect was not the word divorce itself, but that one person had turned it into a master key to unlock every selfish demand, while the other had built a habit of bowing their head every time the lock clicked. Following that pattern of intimidation, I walked on eggshells. It was not that I lacked backbone, but an invisible tether constantly pulled me backward. Whenever I wanted to stand my ground, the fear of a fractured family and weeping children made me whisper, "Just let it go." My career was the sole sanctuary where I retained a piece of myself. I worked for a large corporate food service enterprise that supplied cafeterias for school districts and business corporate parks across the tri-state area. I had started at the ground level in dispatch logistics, checking dry goods inventory in chilly warehouses, riding along on delivery trucks during winter storms, and working through the night when commercial refrigeration failed. It took me more than 10 years of relentless dedication to rise to director of operations. I oversaw nearly 20 team members. I was not a corporate executive titan, but whenever operational crises emerged, I was the first person my leadership team called. Years ago, Julian had been proud of my career. At dinner parties, when acquaintances asked what I did, he would beam. "My wife manages an entire regional division. Give her any logistical mess, and she sorts it out." I had felt so appreciated. But as time went on, that very competence began to agitate him. Perhaps it was because my career was undeniable proof that my world did not revolve entirely around his orbit. One rainy Thursday, a central preparation kitchen suffered a catastrophic power failure. A refrigerated delivery van broke down on the highway, and 3 private school accounts were calling frantically about late lunch deliveries. I had to remain at the regional headquarters with my dispatchers, rerouting drivers and coordinating backup commissary kitchens. I called Julian early in the afternoon. "Julian, I will be late this evening. We have a major delivery emergency across 3 school districts." He asked immediately, "How late is late?" "I cannot say for certain until we clear the transport backlog. I will head home the minute it is resolved." He paused for a few seconds before saying coldly, "Make sure you are home for dinner." "I will do my best," I replied. Gretchen, our part-time housekeeper, had already prepared dinner as scheduled. I had even texted her to ensure Miriam's soup was warmed and reminded her about Miriam's evening medication. By the time I pulled into the driveway, it was nearly 8 o'clock in the evening. The moment I stepped inside, I found Julian sitting in the living room. The television was on, but his eyes were fixed on the front door. Miriam was sitting at the kitchen island, having already finished her meal. I set my briefcase down. "I am home." Julian did not greet me. He glanced up at the wall clock and asked in a low, biting voice, "Who gave you permission to come home at this hour?" I stopped in my tracks. The question made me feel less like his wife and more like a truant teenager. "I called and told you there was a crisis at work," I said, keeping my voice calm. Julian did not budge. "I know you were working, but this household also has responsibilities. Dinner was cooked by Gretchen. Your mother has eaten, and Wesley and Kendra are capable of getting their own plates. Was there an emergency here? If so, why did you not call me? So if there is no emergency, you can just wander in whenever you please?" I felt blood rushing to my cheeks, but I fought to keep my composure. "That is completely unfair, Julian. I was at my job. not out socializing. Miriam let out a long theatrical sigh from the kitchen island. All right, keep your voices down. I have eaten. Nobody is starving. I thought she was stepping in to diffuse the tension, but she immediately continued. Still, a married woman needs to know what time she belongs at home. Having your husband sit around waiting looks terrible to the neighbors. I turned to her. Miriam, I notified Julian hours ago. Crises happen in management. It is not as if I do this every night. Julian cut in, his voice rising. The issue is not whether it happens once or multiple times. Then what is the issue? The issue is that my words mean nothing to you. I looked at him, and all my rational explanations suddenly felt entirely futile. What exactly do you want from me, Julian? As a wife, your priority must be this family. I have always prioritized this family. Prioritizing the family means being home at 8 o'clock at night? I let out a dry, incredulous laugh. I stayed late to solve an operational crisis so I could keep my job. I have responsibilities to my staff, to our clients. If I abandon my team in the middle of a disaster just so I can sit at the dining table at 6 o'clock sharp, why would the company employ me as a director? Julian stood up, towering over me. You are getting more argumentative by the day. I refused to back down. I am not being argumentative. I am speaking reasonably. He pointed his finger directly at the floor. Under this roof, there are rules. I met his gaze dead on. And who established these rules? Julian answered without a second of hesitation. I did. I stood utterly stunned. It was not because I had never noticed his controlling nature, but because it was the very first time he had stated it so brazenly, as if it were an absolute law. There are 4 adults living in this house, plus your mother, I said slowly. Why are the rules established solely by you? Because I am the man of this house. The answer was so cold and absolute it sucked the air from the room. Just then, Kendra walked down the stairs. She had clearly overheard the argument. Standing at the landing, she spoke in a small but steady voice. Dad. Mom works full-time just like you do. Julian spun around, glaring at her. Kendra, go back upstairs to your room. Kendra did not move immediately. I am just saying, Mom was at work. She was not out having fun. I told you to go to your room, Julian bellowed, his voice shaking the banister. I looked at my daughter. Kendra, sweetheart, go back up to your room. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and frustration. She turned, but before ascending the stairs, she whispered, I do not think Mom did anything wrong. The living room fell into dead silence. Julian watched her leave, his face dark with fury. He turned back to me. Is that how you raise our daughter? Teaching her to talk back to her father? I have never taught our children to disrespect you, I replied. You did not teach her? Then why is she standing there defending you? She is 19 years old, Julian. She has eyes and ears. She sees what happens. Julian scoffed bitterly. There it is. You spend so much time at your corporate job that you bring your manager attitude right into our home. No, Julian. You are the one speaking to me as if I were your subordinate. Miriam immediately intervened. All right, Cora, that is enough. Just drop it. I turned to my mother-in-law. Miriam, why is it always me who has to drop it? Have you ever once told Julian to lower his voice or compromise? Miriam faltered for a second, then muttered, When a man is angry, a woman should smooth things over. I said nothing more. I picked up my briefcase and walked upstairs, my chest feeling as though it were weighted down with lead. That night, I lay in bed facing away from Julian. He did not utter a word either. The room was so quiet I could hear the distant hum of traffic on the avenue. My mind kept returning to Kendra's eyes at the staircase. In the past, I had always told myself that I swallowed my pride for the sake of the children. But for the very first time, I asked myself, if Kendra gets married one day, and her husband declares that his word is absolute law, will she follow her mother's example and endure it in silence? That thought sent a shiver down my spine. The things we endure as mothers are not always noble sacrifices. When taken too far, they become toxic blueprints for our children. I did not want Kendra growing up believing that being a wife meant begging for permission to live her own life. From that night forward, every time I walked through my front door, I no longer merely wondered if dinner was prepared. I began asking myself, is this truly my home? Or is it merely a place where I am permitted to stay, provided I remain completely obedient? After that confrontation, an unsettling distance settled between Julian and me. Neither of us brought it up again. The next morning, he left for work as usual. I got dressed and headed to my office. Miriam sat on the back patio doing her morning stretches. On the surface, the household appeared undisturbed. Yet I began viewing everything through an unclouded lens. Miriam was in her early 70s. She had mild hypertension and minor arthritis in her knees, but she was far from frail. In the mornings, she walked to the local bakery with a neighborhood walking group. On weekends, if her friends invited her to church luncheons or antique fairs, she dressed faster than anyone in the house. We also employed Gretchen 3 days a week to handle heavy cleaning, laundry, and meal prep. On days when I was busy, I coordinated with Gretchen to ensure fresh groceries were stocked. I organized Miriam's pills into weekly dispenser boxes and tracked her medical appointments on my phone. I never claimed to be a saintly daughter-in-law, but I had never neglected her care. Yet an utterly minor incident became Julian's catalyst to issue his most extreme ultimatum yet. One Tuesday afternoon, Miriam attended a garden tea gathering with several women from the neighborhood. When she returned, she sat at the kitchen island while I was washing apples, remarking casually, "You know, Mrs. Harrington down the block is truly blessed." "Why is that, Miriam?" I asked politely. Her daughter-in-law cooks a fresh, hot breakfast for her every single morning, and in the evenings, she prepares an Epsom salt foot bath and massages her knees. I smiled faintly. "Well, Mrs. Harrington is very fortunate." Miriam paused, letting out a heavy sigh. "Two women can both have daughters-in-law, yet their fortunes are worlds apart." My hand holding an apple under the water stopped. I knew exactly who that comment was aimed at, but unwilling to ignite a conflict over petty envy, I replied gently, "If your knees are aching tonight, I can prepare a warm foot soak for you. And if you would like hot oatmeal in the mornings, I can ask Gretchen to prep it so all you have to do is warm it up." Miriam instantly recoiled, her tone dripping with passive aggression. "Oh, please. I would never dare make demands of you." Her tone felt heavier than an outright demand. I wiped my hands on a dish towel. "Miriam, if there is something specific you need, just tell me directly. If I can accommodate it, I will." She looked at me coldly. "You are always buried in your corporate career. If I say anything, it just becomes an inconvenience." Before I could reply, Julian walked through the back door and caught the tail end of the conversation. "What is going on?" Miriam waved her hand dismissively. "Nothing, son. Just meaningless chatter." Julian looked from his mother to me. "Tell me, Mom." She played the reluctant victim, but within 2 minutes, the entire story of Mrs. Harrington, the hot breakfast, and the nightly foot soaks had been laid out in full detail. Julian said nothing at that moment, and I assumed the matter was forgotten. Until late that evening, after the children had retired to their rooms, Julian called me into our bedroom. "We need to talk," he said, sitting on the edge of the mattress. I was folding clean laundry from the basket. "Go ahead." Julian crossed his arms and announced in a flat, matter-of-fact tone, "By the end of this month, you are resigning from your job." I thought my ears were playing tricks on me. I turned around, a sweater in my hands. "What did you just say?" "I said you are leaving your job to stay home and look after my mother full-time." He spoke with the casual ease of someone announcing a change in the weekend dinner menu. I set the sweater down. "Are you asking for my thoughts, or are you issuing a decree?" Julian frowned. "What is there to ask? My mother is aging, and our family does not need your paycheck to survive." I looked at him steadily. "Your mother is fully independent, and I have never neglected her needs. Not neglecting someone is not the same as taking proper care of them. And what, in your opinion, constitutes proper care?" Julian shifted uncomfortably. "At the very least, having someone present in the house whenever she needs something. If your mother genuinely reaches a stage where she requires full-time assistance," I answered, "we can increase Gretchen's hours or hire a certified home health aide. I will continue taking her to all her doctor appointments, just as I always have." Julian immediately dismissed it. "We do not need strangers in this house. Why on earth would we pay an outsider to care for my mother when she has an able-bodied daughter-in-law living right here? It makes us look ridiculous. So an able-bodied woman is not allowed to have her own professional career? Julian exhaled sharply. Stop nitpicking my words, Cora. I am not nitpicking. I am asking about my livelihood. It is just a job. If you quit, they will hire someone else. Corporations have plenty of employees. That sentence cut deeper than he realized. It had taken me over a decade of early mornings, missed holidays, and relentless effort to earn my position as director of operations. I had built teams, resolved crises, and earned the respect of my industry. To Julian, all of that meant nothing more than, corporations have plenty of employees. I spoke slowly, measuring every word. That is a career I have built over 10 years. So what? So it matters to me. Julian let out a derisive scoff. It matters so much that it comes before your family? There it was again, that familiar emotional blackmail. Whenever Julian wanted me to surrender a piece of my identity, he pitted it against the family. If I held on to it, I was branded selfish. Why does it always have to be one or the other, Julian? I asked. Does having a career mean I cease being a wife or a daughter-in-law? Julian stood up, his jaw set. Let me be blunt. This family does not need my wife running around all day managing delivery trucks just to earn a few dollars. I do not work simply because we need grocery money. Then why do you work? Because I have professional expertise, because I have responsibilities to my team, and because I find purpose in my work. Julian shook his head, as if I had uttered pure madness. A woman approaching 50. What kind of career delusions are you chasing? I laughed softly, a bitter edge to my voice. How strange. When I was promoted to director, you bragged to all your friends at the golf club about how capable your wife was. That was different. How was it different? Back then, my mother did not need you. Did your mother explicitly tell you she needs a full-time servant? I pressed. Julian paused for a fraction of a second, and I knew the answer immediately. No. Miriam had not requested it outright. This was not about genuine elder care. It was the direct fallout of a petty comparison. Miriam saw another woman receiving constant pampering and felt slighted. Julian saw his mother's bruised ego and demanded I dismantle my entire professional life to prove his mother was paramount. If your mother becomes genuinely ill or frail, I said firmly, I will work with you to find the best care possible. But I will not surrender my career simply because a neighbor down the street got a hot bowl of oatmeal. Julian's expression darkened. Are you blaming my mother? I am not blaming anyone. Then hand in your resignation. Looking at him, the entire dynamic became crystal clear for the first time in my life. He was not searching for a practical solution. He was demanding total submission. If I hired the best private nurse in the county, he would reject it. If I managed to juggle both work and caregiving flawlessly, he would ignore it. The only outcome that would satisfy him was my complete obedience. And what if I refused to resign? I asked quietly. Julian locked his eyes onto mine, cold and uncompromising. I do not want this marriage to turn into a battlefield, Cora. You are the one attempting to destroy my career, Julian. You are demanding I submit, and I am telling you I will not. Outside our bedroom door, I heard the faint shuffle of slippers pausing in the hallway. Miriam was listening. Julian lowered his voice, delivering his final decree. Cora, I will say this once. By the end of the month, you quit that job. I replied with equal finality. And I will answer once. I will not. The room plunged into silence. A moment later, Julian gave a tight, chilling nod. Fine. I knew that tone. True to form, he delivered his customary weapon. If you believe your career is more important than your husband, more important than my mother, and more important than this household, then we should just get a divorce. Outside the doorway, Miriam did not step in to mediate or caution her son. I looked at Julian. This time, I felt no rush of panic, no urge to plead or explain. Only one realization crystallized in my soul. A foot soak can be prepared in minutes, and a breakfast can be cooked by anyone. But if I surrendered my career today because my husband commanded it, what part of my soul would he demand I abandon tomorrow? I did not know. I only knew that for the first time in over 20 years of marriage, when Julian uttered the word divorce, I did not feel an ounce of guilt. After dropping his ultimatum, Julian turned on his heel and walked into the adjoining bathroom, leaving me sitting alone on the edge of the bed. I looked at the folded laundry in my hands and felt a strange, detached amusement. A career I had spent over a decade building was dismissed as disposable in a single sentence. And those two words, "get divorced," which used to rob me of sleep for days, no longer frightened me. It was not that the pain had vanished, rather, a different question had taken root. If every disagreement results in my marriage being placed on the auction block, am I truly living with a partner, or am I living under a permanent hostage crisis? Julian gave me 1 week to reconsider. Throughout that entire week, he never brought up the resignation again. He went to his office, came home for dinner, asked Wesley about his job search, and reminded Kendra about her college examinations. To an outsider, the house seemed entirely normal. But I knew he was waiting. Julian was utterly convinced that I would eventually break down and apologize, exactly as I had done for 20 years. Miriam believed the same. One morning, as I gathered my coat for work, she sat sipping her tea and noted casually, "A woman at our age needs to realize that preserving her marriage is what truly matters. Having a career is fine, but nobody starves without one." I merely replied, "I understand your perspective, Miriam." She smiled, convinced I was softening. By Sunday evening, the entire family gathered around the dining table. I had prepared a traditional pot roast with roasted potatoes, carrots, and a fresh green salad. Ordinary comfort food, yet the tension around the table was so thick that the clinking of silverware sounded unnaturally loud. Halfway through his meal, Julian set his fork down. He looked directly at me. "I am asking you one final time. Have you thought it over?" I set my fork down as well. "I have." "So you are stepping down at the end of the month?" I shook my head calmly. "No. I am keeping my position." Julian's face instantly hardened. Miriam let out a sharp gasp. "Cora, I thought you had come to your senses over the past few days." I turned to her. "I see the situation with total clarity, Miriam. And I see no valid reason to abandon my career." Julian let out a dry, venomous chuckle. "So an entire week of thinking produced nothing more than this?" "I thought about a great deal more than that, Julian," I replied. "For instance, I realized you do not care about finding better care for your mother. You only care about whether I obey your commands." Julian's brow furrowed. "Do not start with your psychoanalysis. I am speaking plain truth." Miriam placed her linen napkin on the table. "Stop arguing. Let me speak honestly. What is the point of a woman clinging to a job title when she is nearly 50? The children are practically grown. Keeping your husband happy and your home intact is your primary duty." A cold sensation washed over me. I asked her, "Miriam, do you truly believe that if I trap myself in this kitchen all day, our family will magically become happier?" "At the very least," she snapped, "a husband would not come home to an empty house." I smiled faintly. "I work 40 hours a week, just as Julian does. Men and women are different," Miriam asserted, as if reciting scripture. Julian nodded firmly, vindicated that his mother had voiced his thoughts. Throughout the dinner, Wesley had kept his head down, eating slowly. Our son was naturally reserved, especially regarding his parents' conflicts. But I noticed his fork moving slower and slower. Kendra, however, could no longer contain herself. She laid her silverware down. "Dad, may I ask you a question?" Julian turned to her. "What is it? Do you actually want a divorce from Mom?" The entire table went dead silent. I looked at my daughter. Julian stared at her, stunned, as if he could not believe what had just come out of her mouth. "What kind of question is that, Kendra?" he demanded. Kendra sat with her back straight. "I am asking honestly, Dad. Do you genuinely want to leave Mom?" Miriam immediately intervened. "Kendra, stay out of adult matters." Kendra turned to her grandmother. "I do not want to interfere, Grandma, but every single time Mom and Dad have a disagreement, I hear Dad say the word divorce. So I want to know if he genuinely means it." Julian's face flushed with anger. "What I say to your mother is between the two of us. Except I live in this house, Dad, and I hear it constantly," Kendra replied, her voice trembling slightly, though she refused to back down. "If you genuinely wanted a divorce, why have you not filed for 1 year ago?" No one spoke. Even Miriam sat motionless. Kendra looked at her father and continued. "Every time Mom disagrees with you, you threaten her with divorce. Then Mom backs down, and everything goes back to normal. You do not actually want a divorce, Dad. You just want Mom to be afraid of you. Hearing those words from my 19-year-old daughter was like watching an immense curtain being torn away from my eyes. Julian shoved his chair back and stood up furiously. Go to your room right now. Kendra's eyes welled with tears. I was not being disrespectful, Dad. I said go to your room. I placed a gentle hand on her arm. Kendra, go upstairs, sweetheart. She looked at me with eyes full of sorrow and fierce loyalty. She stood up, but before walking away, she whispered, I just do not want you to live in fear anymore, Mom. Her footsteps echoed up the wooden staircase until her bedroom door closed. The dining room remained frozen. Julian turned on me, his voice shaking with fury. What lies have you been feeding our daughter? I looked at him calmly. I have never said a word to her. You expect me to believe she came up with that on her own? Wesley finally spoke up from his seat. Dad, Kendra did not need Mom to say anything. Julian swung around to his son. You too, Wesley? Wesley maintained a calm, steady tone. I am not taking sides, Dad, but we have both heard you threaten Mom with divorce for as long as we can remember. Miriam quickly chimed in. Wesley, stop it. Do not agitate your father. Wesley fell silent. Looking at my two children, the pain cut deeper than Julian's demand for my resignation. I had spent 2 decades convincing myself that my silence was shielding my children. In reality, they had been forced to grow up under the shadow of constant emotional coercion. That night, Julian lay with his back turned to me. He did not say a word, and for the first time in our marriage, I did not make an effort to bridge the silence before falling asleep. In the darkness, Kendra's words echoed endlessly in my mind. You do not actually want a divorce. You just want Mom to be afraid. I replayed every single concession I had made over the years, the luxury vehicle, the skipped family visits, the canceled conference, the paint colors, the endless times I was in the right, yet bowed my head to apologize. Everything aligned into a crystal-clear pattern. Julian did not want to lose me. He wanted to keep me imprisoned by the fear that if I did not obey, my world would shatter. The more terrified I was, the easier it was for him to dictate my life. In the quiet hours before dawn, I slipped out of bed and walked onto the small upstairs balcony. The street below was dark and still, save for the early morning breeze rustling through the maple trees. I stood there for a long time. I refused to act out of reckless anger. I had no intention of throwing a divorce petition on the table the next morning, merely to prove my pride. I needed to know with absolute certainty whether I could stand firmly on my own 2 feet if this marriage ended. I gave myself a strict deadline, 30 days. During those 30 days, I would not argue with Julian about divorce. I would thoroughly examine our legal assets, my financial standing, our marital property, and the deep-seated fears that had paralyzed me for decades. If, after 30 days, I concluded this marriage was still worth saving, I would attempt one final, honest conversation with him. But if I recognized that what I was protecting was merely a household where one person ruled by decree while the other lived on eggshells, then the next time Julian wielded the word divorce, I would not plead with him to reconsider. I would give him a definitive answer. Yes. I honored the promise I made to myself. After that dawn on the balcony, I kept my plan entirely private from Wesley and Kendra. They were already burdened by our tension, and I refused to turn our children into emotional allies. Nor would I ever give Julian an excuse to claim I had turned them against their father. The following morning, I went to work as usual. I checked in on Miriam's medication schedule, texted Gretchen regarding grocery lists, and answered Julian politely whenever he asked about my schedule. Only one thing had shifted. I had embarked on a journey to find the truth about my own life. Through a trusted colleague, I scheduled a consultation with attorney Carolyn Mercer, an experienced family law practitioner specializing in marital dissolution and asset division in Connecticut. When I called her office, I simply stated that I required comprehensive legal counsel before making any permanent decisions. We met at her downtown office on a Tuesday afternoon. I carried a thick accordion folder containing our marriage certificate, the original premarital deed of gift for the house signed by my parents, records of major home improvement permits, our vehicle titles, joint bank statements, and a detailed ledger of our household expenditures. Upon seeing the organized folder, Attorney Mercer smiled warmly. You are far more prepared than most clients who walk through my door. I offered a faint smile. I prepared because I was terrified of what I did not know. She did not ask salacious questions about infidelity, Nor did she push me to file immediately. She poured a glass of water, sat across from me, and asked gently, "What is your primary concern, Corinne?" I paused for a moment. First and foremost, is the house I live in truly my separate property? The question felt surreal, a home gifted exclusively to me by my parents, titled in my name, yet after living with a man for over 20 years, I had to ask an attorney whether it was still mine. Attorney Mercer reviewed the documents meticulously. After your marriage, did you ever execute a quitclaim deed adding your husband to the title? No. Did you ever sign a postnuptial agreement granting him an ownership share? No. Did you refinance the mortgage jointly or alter the deed of ownership? There is no mortgage. The house was owned outright, and the deed remains solely in my name. She nodded. Under state law, this property is clearly classified as separate, premarital property gifted solely to you. However, you mentioned that marital funds were utilized over the years for substantial renovations. The kitchen overhaul, the bathroom remodel, and the patio addition. Is that correct? Yes, I answered. We spent joint savings across several renovation projects. Then we must calculate the value of those contributions, Attorney Mercer explained. Do not assume that because the title is in your name, marital investments vanish into thin air. If marital funds enhance the property's equity or value, the court or a settlement agreement will require an equitable financial reimbursement or offset. If you want a clean, indisputable resolution, fairness is your greatest strength. Sitting in that chair, a profound sense of relief washed over me. I had no desire to take a single dollar that rightfully belonged to Julian, but I was equally determined never again to let someone claim ownership of my inheritance out of fear of looking calculating. If we proceed with a divorce, I asked, do I have the legal right to demand he vacate the premises immediately? Attorney Mercer looked at me with measured seriousness. Are you contemplating changing the locks? I confessed honestly. The thought crossed my mind in moments of anger. She offered a gentle, knowing smile. Never make legal maneuvers out of spite. While the house is your separate asset, it has served as the established marital residence for over 20 years. You cannot simply throw his belongings onto the driveway or lock him out overnight without an agreed-upon move-out date or a court order. Establish a reasonable, negotiated move-out timeline. Do not transform yourself from a person with the law on her side into someone guilty of an unlawful eviction. I looked down at my hands. Her advice grounded me completely. In my heated moments, I had envisioned packing Julian's bags and placing them on the porch. It might have felt momentarily satisfying, but real life requires dignity and legal precision. What should my preparation checklist look like? I asked. Attorney Mercer drew a legal pad closer. First, maintain certified copies of all separate property deeds and personal records. Second, compile a full inventory of all marital assets, bank accounts, retirement funds, vehicles without transferring or hiding funds. Third, gather every available invoice for home renovations. Fourth, review your independent monthly cash flow. And fifth, determine in your heart whether you want a divorce due to a single heated argument or because a toxic behavioral pattern has exhausted your marriage. I looked at her. The fifth one is the hardest. It always is. She agreed softly. The law can determine who owns what asset, Corinne, but no attorney can decide whether your marriage has reached its natural end. I remained in her office for nearly 2 hours. When I shared how Julian routinely brandished divorce whenever I resisted his demands, Attorney Mercer did not offer moral platitudes. She simply asked, after he issues that threat, how does the conflict usually resolve? I surrender, I answered instantly. Has he ever apologized for using divorce as a tool of coercion? I thought for a long moment. Almost never. Then, ask yourself one question. What will he do the day you refuse to surrender? I had no answer. But that question stayed with me throughout my drive home, looking at the evening commuters navigating the suburban avenues, each person heading toward their own destination. I felt like someone who had spent decades trapped in a windowless room, suddenly realizing that doors existed all around her. I did not feel an instant surge of power, but my fear had finally taken a distinct, manageable shape. And once fear has boundaries, it loses its ability to paralyze you. When I arrived home, Julian asked why I was late. I had personal matters to attend to, I replied evenly. He studied me suspiciously. What kind of matters? When the time is right, I will share what is necessary. Julian frowned, clearly unaccustomed to such calm boundaries. I walked upstairs without offering further explanation. In marriage, many people believe an unbreakable chain holds them captive, only to discover that one end of the chain was in their own hand all along. The more we tremble, the tighter we pull the knot. The next domain I needed to examine was the very tool Julian had used for decades to convince me I could never survive without him. Finances. If a woman wants to know whether she can stand independently, there are financial numbers she can no longer afford to avoid. During a quiet lunch break at my office, I logged into our banking portals, retrieved digital tax returns, reviewed years of electronic statements, and opened the household expense ledgers I had kept intermittently. Initially, I assumed the review would take 20 minutes. Instead, I sat at my desk for hours. Wesley's college tuition installments, Kendra's academic expenses, health insurance deductibles, weekly groceries, utility bills, Miriam's prescriptions, and Gretchen's housekeeping fees. The vast majority had been paid directly from my personal checking account and my direct deposit earnings. It was not that Julian contributed nothing. He paid the auto insurance, handled occasional large tuition payments, covered holiday family trips, and funded a significant portion when we purchased our family sport utility vehicle. I documented every single dollar he spent. I had no desire to turn our marriage into a petty balance sheet, but I refused to continue believing a false narrative simply because the narrator spoke with absolute authority. I created an organized spreadsheet divided into clear categories: housing, children, daily living, healthcare, savings, and capital improvements. The resulting numbers shattered the illusion I had lived under. For decades, I had carried the subconscious belief that Julian was the primary breadwinner carrying the financial weight of our family, while my earnings were merely supplementary. I remembered wanting to purchase a high-end automated blood pressure monitor for my mother, and Julian snapping, "We have endless expenses this month, Cora, and you keep spending money outside our household." I had swallowed my words in shame. Yet looking at the bank records for that exact month, it was my paycheck that had covered the electric bill, Kendra's semester fees, and Miriam's cardiology prescriptions. I looked at the screen with a mixture of sorrow and liberation. Sorrow, because I had undervalued my own labor for 20 years. Liberation, because I realized with mathematical certainty that without Julian, my children and I would not collapse. Julian was not withholding funds out of malice. Rather, he possessed an immaculate memory for every dollar he spent, while dismissing everything I paid for as routine household chores. Groceries, utilities, and pharmacy bills were treated as invisible expenses, yet accumulated over 2 decades. Those small expenses constituted the very bedrock of our family's daily survival. That evening, after the house grew quiet, I retrieved our home lockbox to review our major joint assets, our shared savings account, the family sport utility vehicle Julian drove daily, valuable furniture, and the total funds invested in home renovations over the years. I logged every detail meticulously, deliberately documenting items in Julian's favor. Where receipts showed home improvements paid directly from his account, I flagged them for full credit. Where payments came from my account during the marriage, I noted them as marital funds subject to equitable distribution. I remembered Attorney Mercer's counsel: if you want to walk away with your dignity intact, never let wounded pride make you unfair. I had no desire to shortchange Julian by a single cent. I simply needed to establish where my boundaries lay. Looking at our joint savings balance, I realized that with a few clicks, I could easily transfer half the funds into an individual account. The temptation flickered briefly. Then I closed the browser. If this marriage truly ended, I wanted to look back and know that I had prepared with absolute transparency, never covertly siphoning what belonged to both of us. While I was organizing the files, Julian walked into the room. "What are you working on?" "I am organizing our family financial records," I said. He picked up a statement, glancing at it. "Everything is perfectly fine." "Why are you suddenly digging through old paperwork?" I gently took the paper back. "It has been a long time since I reviewed our full portfolio." I wanted clarity. He studied me for a moment. "What are you plotting?" "I am simply gaining a clear understanding of our financial reality." Julian laughed dismissively. "Is there anything about this house you do not already know?" "There are things right in front of our eyes that we can fundamentally misunderstand for years, Julian." He ignored the deeper meaning, unfastened his wristwatch, and asked, "Have you finalized your resignation letter yet?" I closed the folder. "I am still considering my options." He nodded with smug satisfaction. "I am telling you, Cora, you stay home, and you will lack for nothing. My salary is more than enough to provide for you." This time, his words elicited no fear. I looked at him calmly. "Julian, do you know approximately how much our household spends each month?" He hesitated. "Well, electricity, groceries, minor miscellaneous expenses. What about Kendra's college fees? Your mother's prescriptions? Gretchen's housekeeping wages?" Julian frowned, irritated. "Why are you interrogating me over daily expenses?" I smiled softly. "No reason. Just curious." He stared at me for a few seconds, then walked into the bathroom. As the door closed, I noticed that my hands were completely steady. In the past, whenever Julian declared that his income was enough to support me, I immediately felt indebted, viewing him as my sole anchor. Now, I understood that an anchor is not merely the person who brings home a large paycheck. A family stays afloat because of hundreds of unseen, uncredited tasks managed day in and day out. I was not living off Julian, and Julian was not living off me. We were sustaining this household together. That simple reality was something I should have understood decades ago. The following afternoon, I calculated a standalone budget based exclusively on my salary. My income as director of operations was more than sufficient to cover property taxes, utilities, personal insurance, supporting my mother when necessary, and contributing to my children's needs. I was not immensely wealthy, but I was fully self-reliant. Those two words, self-reliant, meant more to me than any bank balance. For years, my greatest terror was not merely the emotional loss of a partner, but the dreadful anxiety that I could not survive on my own. Julian had nurtured that fear with remarks like, "You are too used to me handling everything. Out in the real world, you will see how brutal earning a living is. And, without me, let us see how you manage." Now, looking at the spreadsheet, I knew those statements were completely hollow. I packed my laptop, stepped out of my office building, and felt my posture straighten beneath the autumn sky. I had not yet made the final decision to divorce. I had not won a victory over anyone, but a heavy padlock inside my mind had snapped open. If Julian continued using financial threats to convince me I was trapped, that weapon had officially lost all its power. I had not unearthed a secret fortune. I had simply reclaimed the true value of my own labor, and for the first time in 20 years, I understood that if a marriage can only be maintained by instilling terror about survival, it is no longer a sanctuary. It is merely a gilded cage you have inhabited for so long that you forgot you possessed the key to walk out the front door. Having achieved financial clarity, I did not suddenly transform into a combative person. I remained myself. I went to work, picked up Miriam's medications, and asked Wesley and Kendra about their days. However, the way I communicated with Julian shifted fundamentally. Previously, whenever work ran late, I would call him with a hesitant, apologetic tone. "Julian, is it all right if I come home a little late tonight?" It sounded like an ordinary courtesy, but in truth, I was asking for permission to fulfill my professional duties. Now, I adjusted my language. "Julian, I am finalizing a corporate contract this evening and will be home around 8 o'clock. I have already coordinated with Gretchen regarding dinner." The first time he heard that new tone, he paused on the phone. "Are you notifying me, or are you asking me?" "I am notifying you so you are aware, in case there is a household matter that requires attention." He looked at me with deep irritation when I arrived, clearly unsettled. "You have developed quite a different tone lately." "I am simply communicating clearly," I replied calmly. It was nearly impossible for him to manufacture a full-blown argument. I was not neglecting my responsibilities, nor was I disappearing without notice. Everything within my sphere was handled flawlessly, leaving him with nothing to seize upon except an uneasy scowl. Miriam, on the other hand, interpreted my calm demeanor as surrender. One morning, watching me prepare my coat, she asked, "Has your company found your replacement yet?" "I have not spoken to human resources about leaving, Miriam," I replied evenly. She looked surprised. "What about the deadline Julian set?" "I have not decided to resign." Miriam let out a patronizing sigh. "Why remain so stubborn, Cora? Julian only wants peace in this house. A woman who knows when to yield never loses." I chose not to engage in an argument. I understand that is how you see it, Miriam. She appeared quite pleased with my quiet response, convinced her traditional wisdom had finally subdued her daughter-in-law. There was another subtle shift in our household. In the past, whenever Julian's face darkened with anger, I immediately rushed to diffuse the tension, brewing him fresh coffee or finding conversational topics to appease him. I stopped doing that entirely. If he chose to be miserable, he was responsible for managing his own emotions. I treated him with basic courtesy, but I no longer viewed his happiness as my exclusive marital duty. Julian felt the shift. One cool Friday evening, he arrived home early and surprised me by bringing a box of warm blueberry pastries from my favorite local bakery. He placed the box on the counter. I drove past the bakery and remembered you like these when the weather turns cold. I was genuinely touched. Thank you, Julian. We sat at the kitchen island sharing a pastry, neither of us mentioning resignations or ultimatums. For a fleeting moment, I saw a glimpse of the man from our early years, the man who remembered my favorite treats, who had driven through a snowstorm to fetch medicine for our children. A momentary doubt crept into my heart. Am I overreacting? Perhaps Julian is simply rough around the edges. Perhaps if we sit down and communicate with absolute honesty, we can rebuild. Yet before I had even finished my pastry, Julian smiled smugly. You see, is not life so much lighter when we live like this? When you listen to reason, I have no desire to create tension. I looked up at him. That single sentence instantly dragged me back to reality. He did not believe we were mutually compromising. He believed I had finally learned my place. Do you think these past few days have been peaceful because I agreed with you? I asked quietly. Or because you stopped issuing demands? Julian's brow furrowed. What is the difference? There is an immense difference. He leaned back, his voice tightening. Here you go again with your overanalysis. I said nothing more. Not because I was defeated, but because I had received my answer. There was still genuine affection lingering between us. That was precisely what had made my decision so agonizing. If Julian had been entirely cruel, unfaithful, or irresponsible, I would not have spent years rationalizing his behavior. The tragic reality is that a person can buy your favorite pastry while simultaneously believing you must remain entirely subservient to his will. A person can care for his family while suffocating everyone inside it. I did not need to prove Julian was an evil man. I only needed to answer one fundamental question. Do I want to spend the rest of my life living under these conditions? Over the following 2 weeks, I completed every preparatory task. The deed and premarital documentation were secured in a private safety deposit box at our local bank branch. The inventory of joint marital assets was fully finalized. The valuation of our sport utility vehicle, our joint savings, and the exact ledger of home improvement expenses were clearly documented. I also considered a practical reality I had previously avoided. If we separated, where would Julian live? He earned a solid executive income and was more than capable of renting a luxury apartment near his office. But after living in this house for over 20 years, expecting someone to pack their entire life into a suitcase overnight was neither humane nor realistic. I researched several quality apartment complexes located 10 minutes from his workplace, noting rental rates and availability. I did not place deposits. I simply wanted realistic data so that when the moment arrived, we would not operate out of chaotic hostility. In my private notebook, I wrote down a core set of transition principles. If we separate, establish a clear, reasonable move. Out window. No changing locks prematurely. No discarding personal property. No hostile arguments in front of the children. Looking at those handwritten words, a wave of melancholy washed over me. When a woman is in love, she dreams of anniversary trips, family weddings, and growing old together on the porch. Yet here I was, meticulously mapping out a peaceful exit strategy so that the man who had shared my bed for over 2 decades could leave my home without turning our lives into a war zone. That evening, Julian walked into our bedroom and saw me closing my notebook. What are you writing? Personal notes. You have an awful lot of private business lately, he muttered. I looked at him. In the past, I shared every single thought with you to ensure your peace of mind. He smirked. And now you do not need my approval? Whatever concerns our family, I communicate openly. Whatever concerns my independent thoughts, I manage myself. He stood silent for a moment, then asked, "The deadline for your resignation is approaching. Are we set on that?" I closed the notebook gently. "When that day comes, I will give you my final answer." Julian smiled, entirely convinced he had won. "I knew you would come to your senses." He patted my shoulder affectionately before walking out. The irony was unbearable. The closer I came to achieving the inner strength required to walk away, the more Julian convinced himself he had triumphed. He mistook my silence for submission. Miriam mistook my composure for obedience, while I was quietly setting every piece of my life back into its rightful place. And because I was no longer pulling on the chain, Julian failed to notice that the other end had already slipped from his fingers. My mother, Beatrice, was 74 years old. My father had passed away 7 years prior, and since then, she had lived alone in a cozy, single-story home in rural upstate New York. My older sister lived across the country in Oregon, so the responsibility of assisting my mother with medical visits and major home maintenance fell largely on me. My mother was fiercely independent, possessing a quiet dignity that bordered on stubbornness. Whenever I invited her to stay with us for a week, she would smile and say, "Cora, darling, I am perfectly fine on my own." In the countryside, I have my garden and my routine. If I come to the suburbs, I will only get in everyone's way. I knew that phrase, "get in everyone's way," was not just polite banter. My mother rarely spent the night at our house. Years ago, during our first-floor renovation, she had driven down to help supervise the contractors. When Julian returned from work late that evening and saw the bustling house, he had blurted out, "The house is so crowded lately. You cannot take a step without tripping over someone." He had not directed the comment explicitly at my mother, and he likely forgot he had ever said it. But my mother remembered. That very night, she insisted on driving back home. I had caught her arm at the front door. "Mom, it is late and dark outside. Stay until morning." She had simply whispered, "No, sweetheart. I sleep much better in my own bed." Later, I realized she was simply protecting her daughter from marital friction. Miriam had lived under our roof for over 4 years. Not once did my mother ask why her counterpart was permitted to stay indefinitely. Whenever I mentioned driving Miriam to the doctor, my mother would remind me, "She is getting older, Cora. Make sure you look after her prescriptions." When sharing a home, kindness is what matters. My mother never compared or complained. The person who kept score in those final months was me. I began noticing the staggering disparity. Miriam had an entire double closet filled with her wardrobe. My mother brought only a small canvas weekend bag on the rare occasions she visited. Miriam had her own dedicated house key. My mother stood on the front porch and rang the doorbell, calling out, "Cora, sweetheart, are you home?" Whenever Miriam craved a specific dish, I purchased the ingredients immediately. When my mother visited, she brought home-baked pies, fresh preserves from her pantry, and garden vegetables, terrified of causing us the slightest expense. Once, I asked her, "Mom, why do you always haul heavy groceries down here?" She smiled gently. I would feel terrible showing up empty-handed. My heart ached, yet I had allowed this dynamic to persist for years because I was conditioned to accommodate Julian's family to preserve household peace. If my mother felt unwell, I checked Julian's calendar before visiting. If she wanted to visit us, I asked Julian if he had social plans. I told myself it was marital consideration. In truth, only my mother was subjected to that humiliating clearance process. One Tuesday afternoon, my mother called, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Cora dear, my vision has been quite blurry lately. It feels like there is a permanent fog over my left eye, and reading small print is becoming very difficult." My heart seized. "Mom, why did you not tell me sooner?" "I thought it was just natural aging, dear." I asked her to send over her local optometrist's notes, contacted a premier ophthalmology center in the city, and secured an early 8 o'clock appointment for specialized diagnostic testing. I called her back. "Mom, drive down tomorrow afternoon. Stay the night in our downstairs guest room, and I will drive you into the clinic first thing in the morning." There was a long silence on the line. 8 o'clock is very early, Cora. Perhaps I should just wake up at 4 in the morning and drive straight to the clinic from here. I knew she was anxious about intruding. "You are 74 years old, Mom. Driving down dark highways before dawn is dangerous." She gave a nervous laugh. I can manage, dear. Being able to manage does not mean you should endanger yourself. Another pause followed, and then she asked the exact question that broke my heart. Will my staying over bother Julian? Cora, standing by the window in my office, tears stung my eyes. My own mother, wishing to spend a single night under the roof of the home her own husband had gifted to me, was terrified of inconveniencing her son-in-law. Why would you ask that, Mom? Well, I know he prefers a quiet house after work, and having an extra person might disrupt his evening routine. You are staying for one night to attend a medical procedure, Mom. What routine could that possibly disrupt? She chuckled softly. Elderly folks have a way of cluttering up a space, dear. In the past, I might have said, let me double-check with Julian first. This time, I did not. I spoke with absolute clarity. Pack your overnight bag, Mom. When you come to my home, you do not need anyone's permission. Silence followed my words. That was the very first time I had spoken those words aloud. Not our home. Not Julian's home. My home. Not out of spiteful arrogance, but because this house had been gifted to me by my parents precisely so that I would never have to bow my head in fear. Yet for 2 decades, the very mother who had sacrificed to give me that sanctuary had become the most hesitant person to cross its threshold. My mother arrived late Wednesday afternoon. Wesley was still at work, but Kendra rushed home from campus to greet her grandmother. Grandma, why is your bag so tiny? Kendra asked, taking the canvas duffel. My mother smiled. I am only staying one night, darling. Why pack an entire wardrobe? Kendra giggled. Even if you stayed a month, you would still pack that tiny bag. My mother gently tapped her granddaughter's arm. You always tease your grandmother. The atmosphere in the house was warm and peaceful. I prepared the downstairs bedroom so my mother would not have to climb the stairs. Kendra replaced the bed linens with fresh sheets, while I placed a carafe of warm water and her evening vitamins on the nightstand. Miriam returned from an afternoon walk. Seeing my mother in the living room, she paused with mild surprise. Oh, Beatrice, you are here for a visit? My mother smiled politely. Yes, Miriam. I have an early eye clinic appointment in the city tomorrow, so Cora suggested I stay over tonight. Miriam replied smoothly. Well, make yourself comfortable. The interaction appeared entirely civil, and I let out a quiet sigh of relief, thinking I had overthought the situation. The 2 women sat in the living room discussing arthritis remedies and their grandchildren. My mother reached into her bag and handed Miriam a jar of homemade blackberry jam. A little something from my pantry to enjoy with your morning toast. Miriam accepted it with a polite smile. You should not have gone to the trouble, Beatrice. Watching them, a profound sadness washed over me. One woman had lived under my roof for 4 years as an entitlement. The other brought homemade gifts and spoke with careful restraint merely to sleep for a single night. I stepped into the kitchen to finish dinner. Kendra stood beside me, slicing cucumbers. She asked in a low whisper, Mom, is Grandma's eye going to be all right? We will know after the specialist examines her tomorrow. Can I skip my first morning lecture and come with you guys? I shook my head gently. No need, sweetheart. Focus on your classes. I will handle the appointment. Kendra nodded, then glanced toward the living room. Grandma always seems so nervous around Dad, does she not? My knife stopped on the cutting board. You notice that? I have noticed it for years, Mom. I said nothing. It was devastating to realize that no matter how hard adults try to conceal tension, children perceive the truth with total clarity. Around 6:30 in the evening, Julian's sport utility vehicle pulled into the driveway. I heard his keys jingle as he unlocked the front door. My mother reflexively turned toward the foyer, pulling her canvas bag closer to her chair. It was a tiny, instinctive movement of self-effacement, but I saw it, and an overwhelming wave of protective fury rose in my chest. That small canvas bag contained merely a change of clothes, a bottle of eye drops, and a medical appointment card. It was so small, it rested neatly by the armchair. Yet that evening, that tiny bag became the catalyst that exposed the monstrous injustice I had tolerated for far too long. Julian stepped through the foyer and immediately saw my mother's canvas bag resting by the downstairs guest room. He stopped in his tracks, his brow furrowing. Is your mother staying the night? I walked out of the kitchen, wiping my hands on a towel. Yes. She has a specialist eye examination at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I am driving her into the city. Julian looked toward the living room, where my mother sat with Miriam. Hearing his voice, my mother froze. Julian spoke loud enough for the entire ground floor to hear. That does not work. Tell her to head home tonight. Assuming he had misunderstood the logistics, I repeated, Julian, her appointment is at 8 o'clock in the morning. Driving down from upstate before dawn is dangerous. I heard you, he replied coldly. Then why can she not stay? Julian tossed his car keys onto the credenza. I need complete rest tonight. Having extra people in the house makes me irritable. I looked around the spacious living room. There was literally one extra person in the house, my elderly mother, sleeping in a closed room on the ground floor. She is in the downstairs guest room. Julian. She will not disturb you in the slightest. Julian's jaw tightened. Cora, I said no. And that is final. My mother immediately stood up, her face pale. Cora, sweetheart, it is perfectly fine. I can drive home tonight. Please do not argue on my account. I reached out and gently held my mother's arm. Mom, please sit back down. Miriam chose that moment to intervene. Beatrice, you are welcome here, of course. But if Julian has an important day tomorrow and needs absolute quiet, perhaps you should consider his needs. Every household has its established routine. I turned slowly to my mother-in-law. What routine are you referring to, Miriam? She shifted awkwardly. Well, he said he needs quiet. I looked back at Julian, my voice trembling with contained rage. You need quiet to the point where my mother cannot sleep in a guest room for one single night? Julian's patience snapped. Do not turn a simple matter into a federal case. This house is not a hotel where people can just check in and out whenever they please. We have our own family routine to maintain. The words, "This house is not a hotel," echoed through the living room like a physical slap across my face. My mother quietly reached down, her hands trembling as she pulled her canvas bag toward her chest. Watching her, 20 years of memories flooded my mind. Miriam had occupied a private master suite on the second floor for over 4 years. Her clothes filled the wardrobes, her medical supplies occupied the cabinets, and she held her own key to the front door. Not once had I ever claimed she was an inconvenience. Yet my mother, holding a bag so small it could be carried with 2 fingers, visiting for a single night before a medical procedure, was branded an intruder checking into a hotel. I looked at Julian and spoke with deliberate, icy precision. Your mother has lived here for over 4 years. Have I ever once complained that this house was crowded? Julian glared at me. Are you seriously comparing my mother to yours? I am asking a very straightforward question. Why is your mother entitled to live here for 4 years, while my mother cannot spend 8 hours in a guest room? Julian's face twisted into an ugly scowl. Do not compare them. Why should I not compare them? Because my mother is different. The living room went dead silent. My mother looked up at her son-in-law, then lowered her head in sheer humiliation. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. That answer had been embedded in Julian's actions for 20 years. This was merely the first time he possessed the audacity to say it aloud. Different in what way, Julian? I demanded. Miriam rushed to his defense. Cora, stop cornering him. A mother-in-law and a biological mother are entirely different positions in a family. I turned on her. I never claimed you were the same person, Miriam. I am asking why. Under this roof, the husband's mother is treated as royalty, while the wife's mother is treated like an unwelcome beggar. Miriam's face turned bright red. How dare you speak to me like that? I live here because my son brought me into his home, and I consented to welcome you. I fired back. I never once objected. So now you are keeping score? She shrieked. I am not keeping score. I am demanding an answer to a fundamental injustice. My mother stood up again, her voice shaking with unspeakable sorrow. Cora, please, stop. I am leaving. Do not destroy your marriage over a single night. I gripped my mother's hands tightly. This is not a minor thing, Mom. She shook her head, tears shining in her eyes. To me, it is minor, sweetheart. I can sleep in my own bed. My throat constricted. The woman who had been grievously insulted was the very person trying to absorb the pain so her daughter would not suffer. No, Mom, I said firmly. You are staying right here. Julian took an aggressive step forward, his voice a menacing growl. Are you defying me in front of everyone? I looked him straight in the eye. I am keeping my mother in this house tonight so she can see her doctor tomorrow. I said no, and my word is final. And I say she stays. For the first time in our marriage, I mirrored his absolute authority. Julian froze for a second, then brought his fist down onto the dining table with a deafening crash. You have lost your mind! Wesley hurried down the stairs, Kendra right behind him, both looking between their father and their grandmother. Miriam pointed an accusatory finger at me. Disgracing your husband in front of family like this? Have you no shame, Cora? I turned toward her. You think Julian is the one who was disgraced tonight? My mother came for medical care, sat in this living room for an hour, and was ordered out into the cold. The person who should be drowning in shame is your son. Cora, please stop. My mother begged quietly. Julian stepped directly into my space. Cora, I am warning you for the last time. Tell your mother to leave. He called her your mother with utter disdain. I looked at him for several long seconds. No. Julian let out a dark, mocking laugh. Fine. You think you are invincible now, do you not? You defy me at work. You argue over every household decision. And now you want to wage war over our mothers. I am not waging war. You have thrown this entire family into chaos. The person who created this chaos is you, Julian. Miriam cried out, Cora! A wife who constantly fights to be right will destroy her own home with her own hands. I looked at my mother-in-law. Must one person be completely crushed so that a home can appear peaceful, Miriam? What is so terrible about yielding? Miriam countered. He is your husband. If he speaks, listening to him will not kill you. I let out a bitter, heartbroken laugh. You are right. It will not kill me physically. It just strips away your humanity, until you have no right to make a single decision in your own life. Julian's remaining restraint completely evaporated. He raised his arm, pointing his finger directly at the front door. If you find living under this roof so intolerable, then let us get a divorce. Get the hell out of this house and let us see how many days you survive on your own. My mother gasped, turning pale. Kendra cried out, Dad! Wesley grabbed his sister's arm, his face rigid with tension. Miriam did not reprimand her son. Instead, she chimed in, he is absolutely right. A woman who thinks she can overpower her husband deserves to go out into the real world and see who truly needs whom. I looked at the two of them, and in that defining moment, a miraculous stillness washed over me. Over the past 30 days, I had confronted every ghost in my closet. I held the deed to this property. I knew my exact financial worth. I knew with absolute certainty that I could thrive outside the shadow of this marriage. And most importantly, I understood that the man standing before me was reaching for his oldest, most reliable weapon because he was entirely convinced I would fall to my knees. I looked at him and asked calmly, Are you certain about that, Julian? Julian glared at me, waiting for the familiar breakdown. He raised his chin arrogantly. I said it, and I stand by it. I glanced at Miriam. She offered no objection. I looked at my children. Kendra was biting her lip, her eyes streaming with tears. Wesley stood motionless, his fists clenched tight. Finally, I looked at my mother, who was shaking her head gently, begging me not to blow up my life for her sake. But this had never been about one night's sleep. The small canvas bag had merely illuminated the unbearable reality that had existed for 20 years. I reached into my pocket, checked the calendar on my phone, and realized my 30-day deadline had concluded that very evening. I put my phone away and met Julian's gaze. All right, that single serene word made him freeze. I did not weep. I did not apologize. I did not ask him to reconsider. I turned gently to my mother. Mom, go into the guest room and get some rest. I will drive you to the clinic at 7 o'clock in the morning. I walked into the kitchen, turned off the burner beneath the simmering pot roast, and placed the lid on the pot, as if this were merely a family dinner that had grown cold. Yet I knew that something monumental had just died in that house. Not our legal marriage, not quite yet. But the paralyzing fear that had kept me silent for 20 years was gone forever. The next morning, I woke before my alarm. My mother was already sitting on the edge of the guest bed, neatly folding her light jacket into her canvas bag. Seeing me enter, she asked anxiously, Did you sleep at all last night, Cora? I opened the curtains, letting the morning sunlight flood the room. I slept peacefully, Mom. My mother looked at me for a long time. Elderly parents possess an intuition that needs no explanation. She whispered softly. I do not wish to interfere in your marriage, Cora. I only carry the terrible guilt that my visit caused this disaster. I sat beside her on the bed and took her hands. Mom, this was never about you. If it was not your visit, it would have been something else next week. Please do not shoulder a burden that does not belong to you. She let out a heavy sigh, gently stroking my hair as she had when I was a young girl. What do you plan to do, darling? I paused for a moment. I am going to do what I have carefully prepared to do. My mother did not ask if I was filing for divorce, nor did she offer hollow advice to throw it all away. She simply squeezed my hands tightly. Live your life so that when your head touches the pillow at night, your conscience is at peace. Do not act out of temporary rage to cause a lifetime of regret, but do not endure endless misery out of fear of what the neighbors might say. Tears pricked my eyes. I drove my mother into the city for her examination. Throughout the morning, she asked the ophthalmologist about her eye drops and follow-up care, never uttering a word about the previous night's horrors. Her dignified silence solidified my resolve. This decision was mine alone, and I would carry it with absolute ownership. After driving my mother safely back to her home upstate, I returned to our suburban neighborhood and called Attorney Mercer. Carolyn, please finalize the settlement petition, I said directly. I have made my decision. Attorney Mercer's voice was steady and professional. Are you entirely certain, Corinne? I am. Let us proceed with precision and complete fairness. I brought our comprehensive asset portfolio to her office that afternoon. We reviewed every single line item. The house remained designated as my sole premarital asset. The sport utility vehicle, our joint investment accounts, and the savings accumulated during the marriage were slated for equal division. The historical funds expended on home renovations were calculated to the exact dollar, and I instructed Attorney Mercer to grant Julian full credit for his contributions. I want everything transparent, I told her. I will not give him any reason to claim I used this divorce to strip him of his rightful share. Attorney Mercer nodded approvingly. Transparency is the most effective shield in matrimonial law. Because Wesley and Kendra were both legal adults, child custody was not an issue. Yet that legal fact did not lessen the weight on my heart. Children being grown does not make the dissolution of their parents' marriage any less painful. 3 days later, I selected a Sunday evening when both Wesley and Kendra were home. I refused to let Julian discover the petition over the phone, nor did I want our children hearing rumors filtered through their grandmother. We had shared 20 years under one roof. The final chapter deserved to be delivered with dignity in the same room. Following dinner, I spoke clearly. Please remain at the table for a few minutes. I have something important to discuss. Julian, holding the television remote, looked over with mild annoyance. What is so serious? I placed my briefcase on the table. Miriam, who was preparing to stand up, sat back down. Wesley looked at the briefcase, his expression solemn. Kendra seemed to anticipate what was coming, her posture tensing immediately. I unclasped the briefcase, retrieved the formal marital settlement agreement, and set it squarely in front of Julian. You demanded a divorce. I agree. Julian stared at me for several seconds, then let out a dry, theatrical chuckle, the laugh of a man convinced his opponent was attempting an amateur bluff. Are you serious right now? Completely serious. He picked up the first page. An uncontested dissolution agreement? Yes. Julian flipped through the subsequent pages, and the smirk slowly died on his face. Attached behind the petition was not merely a standard form. It contained a comprehensive accounting of all marital assets, the certified premarital property deed for the home, an itemized calculation of all historical renovation offsets, and a proposed 30-day transition schedule for vacating the premises. Julian jerked his head up, eyes wide. How long have you been drafting these documents? For 30 days, I answered calmly. The room fell into stunned silence. Miriam turned on me, her voice shrill with outrage. You have been scheming behind your husband's back for an entire month? I was preparing for the exact outcome Julian demanded repeatedly, I replied. Julian threw the documents onto the table. So your silence this past month was just a facade to pull off this ambush? My silence was the time I gave myself to think with absolute clarity. You retained an attorney? He hissed. I did. Julian scoffed bitterly. Unbelievable. Over 20 years of marriage, and you communicate with your husband through lawyers. I am speaking to you directly across this table right now, Julian. I answered without raising my voice. The attorney merely ensured that our rights and obligations are divided lawfully. Kendra, sitting beside me, wiped a tear from her cheek. Mom. I turned to her gently. Kendra, I did not hide this to shock you. I kept it private because I refused to place you and Wesley in the middle. Wesley looked at both of us. Are you two completely sure about this? I am entirely certain of my decision, Wesley, I said. Your father has the full right to decide his part. Julian let out a cold, venomous laugh. Look at you, talking as if I were the one begging you to stay. I never said you were begging, Julian. That statement struck Julian's fragile pride like a whip. He pulled the documents toward him. Miriam grew increasingly agitated, urging her son, "Why are you even hesitating? If she wants to throw her life away, sign it. Let her go out and fend for herself. She will realize soon enough what life is like without a husband." Kendra turned to her grandmother. "Grandma, please." I gently placed my hand over Kendra's wrist. "Kendra, let the adults handle this." Julian gripped his pen. But unlike the countless times he had slapped blank paper onto the counter to intimidate me, his hand hovered over the signature line, visibly hesitating. He looked up, his eyes searching mine. "If I sign this, Cora, there is no turning back. You will not regret this?" I met his gaze steadily. "You should sign this only if you genuinely want a divorce, Julian, not as a psychological test to see if I will tremble." He stared at me, and in that fleeting second, I knew he could have laid the pen down and suggested we seek marriage counseling. Had he done so, I cannot say whether it would have saved our marriage, but it would have been the first time he acknowledged that the word divorce could no longer be used as a whip. He did not do it. Miriam prodded him sharply from the side. "What are you waiting for, Julian? She orchestrated this entire spectacle. Sign it, and do not let her think you are afraid." The words "you are afraid" sealed Julian's fate. His pride triumphed over every rational thought. Julian looked at his mother, glanced at his children, and locked eyes with me. He pressed the pen down and signed his name across the agreement. He tossed the pen onto the wood. "There. You asked for it. You got it." I looked at his signature. There was no surge of triumphant euphoria in my chest, only a profound, quiet clarity. For decades, Julian had believed that the threat of divorce was the ultimate ace in his hand, because I was perpetually terrified of it. That evening, he played his ace. And for the first time in 20 years, I did not scramble to pick it up for him. Julian shoved the paperwork across the table, his tone dripping with defiance. "It is signed. When are you packing your bags and moving out?" I looked at him calmly. "I am not moving out," Julian frowned. "What did you say?" "The person who needs to arrange new living accommodations is you." Miriam burst out laughing. "Have you lost your mind, Cora? My son has lived in this house for over 20 years, and now you are telling him to leave?" I reached into my briefcase, pulled out the secondary blue folder, and placed it on the table. It contained certified copies of the original premarital deed of gift, title registrations, and the comprehensive renovation accounting ledger. "You are fully aware that my parents deeded this property exclusively to me prior to our marriage, Julian," I said. "I have never hidden that fact." Julian flipped through the deed rapidly. "I know the history, but I have lived here for 2 decades. I paid for the new kitchen cabinets, the hardwood floors, the finished basement. Do you expect the law to pretend my money does not exist?" "I am not pretending your contributions do not exist," I said, sliding the spreadsheet toward him. "Every major renovation is accounted for right here. Where joint marital funds were used, I have noted them. The financial offset you are entitled to will be credited directly from our joint assets. I will not take a single dollar that belongs to you." Julian stared at the organized numbers. He had clearly prepared for a chaotic screaming match where the loudest person wins, but he was met with cold, irrefutable documentation that credited his financial input fairly. He looked up, his jaw tight. "You calculated everything." "Because I refuse to give you any reason to claim I used this divorce to rob you." Miriam banged her fist on the table. "What about my son's sweat and labor? Over 20 years of building this home, and you reduce it to a few numbers on a spreadsheet?" I turned to her. "Miriam, I do not deny Julian's labor. But labor within a marriage is not the same as legal title ownership. She glared at me. All I know is that he married you, fathered your children, worked hard, and updated this property. He spent his prime years under this roof. And now you tell him it is not his home? I felt more sorrow than anger. I spent my prime years under this roof as well, Miriam. I worked full-time, raised our children, maintained this home, and took care of you. But I never used my labor to claim that Julian's separate assets belonged to me. Julian growled, "Stop lecturing us." I am not lecturing. I am presenting the legal reality. He shoved the papers away. So what exactly do you expect? Our joint liquid assets and the sport utility vehicle will be divided according to the settlement agreement, with your renovation offset fully credited. However, this real estate remains my separate property, and I will not transfer title. Julian sneered. You think you have backed me into a corner, do you not? I have no desire to corner anyone. Julian, I have simply stopped confusing shared history with your right to dictate my life. Miriam threw her hands up. How utterly heartless. I looked at my mother-in-law. You call me heartless because I am asserting ownership of my inheritance. But when Julian ordered me to pack my bags and get out of this house, did you consider him heartless? Miriam froze. I continued. You have lived under my roof for over 4 years. I never charged you a cent for utilities, groceries, or maintenance. I drove you to cardiology clinics, organized your prescriptions, and cleaned your room. I did all of it because you were my husband's mother. She pressed her lips together. I treated you like a daughter. I smiled sadly. If you truly treated me like a daughter, you would not have stood by silently while your son threw my elderly mother out into the dark, and then blamed me for embarrassing him. The dining room fell into absolute silence. Wesley and Kendra sat at the far end of the table, remaining silent as I had requested. Julian glared at me. So, now you are kicking my mother out onto the street as well? I shook my head. Whether your mother moves to an apartment with you or returns to her home upstate is entirely her choice. But when this marriage concludes, residency must be established legally. You cannot assume this property belongs to your family simply because you are the husband. Julian stood up abruptly. Do not take that arrogant tone with me. I remained seated. You just signed an agreement to dissolve our marriage because you repeatedly threatened divorce. I am simply executing the logistical reality of that decision. You think you are so clever. He spat. No, Julian. I have simply stopped being a fool. His face flushed with fury. He raised his finger, pointing directly at me. Watch how you speak to me. I looked at his outstretched hand, remembering the dozens of times that very finger had pointed toward the front door, forcing me to choose between obedience and abandonment. I stood up. Do you remember what you shouted at me the night my mother was here? Julian went rigid. I repeated every syllable. Get the hell out of this house, and let us see how many days you survive on your own. Miriam looked away. I held Julian's gaze. You shouted those words inside the home my parents gifted to me. You shouted them in front of my mother, your mother, and our children. Julian gritted his teeth. People say things they do not mean when they are angry. You did not say it once. Julian. You said it for 20 years. He had no defense. I raised my arm and pointed steadily toward the front door. Tonight, I am returning those exact words to you. I paused for 1 second. Pack your bags. Julian stared at me in complete shock. I enunciated each word with calm clarity. Get the hell out of my house. Miriam gasped, rising to her feet. You have crossed every line. I turned to her. I am returning the exact words you two used against me, but I will not execute them with your cruelty. I looked back at Julian. I will not throw your clothes onto the lawn tonight. I will not change the deadbolts tomorrow morning. You will have a reasonable 30-day window to secure an apartment and hire movers. Julian let out a bitter scoff. You act as if you are granting me charity. No, I am ensuring that this marriage ends with civilized dignity. You are evicting me from my home. There is nothing civilized about it. There is an immense difference, Julian, I replied steadily. You ordered me out because I refused to be your subordinate. I am requiring you to relocate because we have mutually agreed to terminate our marriage, and this real estate is not an asset you are entitled to seize. Wesley spoke up softly from the corner. Dad, Mom is not telling you to leave tonight. Julian snapped at his son. Be quiet, Wesley. Wesley did not argue. He simply sat back down, holding Kendra's trembling hand. I lowered my voice. Let us not wage a war in front of the children. Julian laughed bitterly. Now you pretend to care about the children. Caring about our children is precisely why I refuse to let this dissolve into chaos. Miriam's tone suddenly shifted from outrage to pleading. Cora, you two have been married for over 20 years. Everything can be talked through. Using such harsh language with your husband destroys every ounce of family loyalty. I looked at her. Minutes earlier, she had declared that this house belonged entirely to her son. Now that she realized Julian was the one who had to pack, she reached for family loyalty. I did not mock her. Loyalty cannot be a concept you only remember when you lose your leverage, Miriam. Julian sat back down, his expression completely hollow. For the first time in over 20 years, he had no threat left that could force me to retreat. Not because I shouted louder, but because his ultimate weapon had expired. The petition was signed, our marital assets were laid out for fair division, and the property had returned to its lawful owner. I clicked my briefcase shut. No one in that dining room uttered another word. For 2 decades, Julian had believed that he held the exclusive right to point toward the front door. That evening, he finally understood that the door had never belonged to him to wield as a weapon against me. During the first 2 days following that confrontation, Julian barely spoke to me beyond absolute household necessities. He left for work on schedule, ate his meals, and asked Wesley about job interviews, but I knew he was waiting. He was waiting for me to break. In the past, following every major conflict, I was always the one who broke the silence. Sometimes it was a gentle, let us just put this behind us. Other times it was placing a fresh mug of coffee beside his laptop. Julian was accustomed to the belief that if he stonewalled long enough, my anxiety would force me to initiate peace. This time, I did nothing. I treated him with basic courtesy, but I made no effort to mend the silence. By Tuesday evening, his patience wore thin. As I was hanging coats in the hallway closet, he appeared in the doorway. Are you truly going through with this? I did not look up immediately. Going through with what? The divorce. I closed the closet door. You signed the agreement, Julian. He scowled. I was furious that night. Which night? I asked calmly. He faltered. The night you demanded I quit my career? The night you threw my mother out? Or the hundreds of nights over the past 20 years? Julian had no answer. That silence spoke volumes. A threat repeated for decades is not a momentary slip of the tongue. It is a lifestyle. He pulled out a hallway chair and sat down heavily. We have been married for 2 decades, Cora. Everyone says things they regret in the heat of an argument. Yes, I agreed. The difference is that you were the one who said cruel things over and over again, while I was the one forced to swallow them. Julian exhaled sharply. So what do you want? Do you expect me to drop to my knees and beg for forgiveness? I shook my head. No, Julian. I simply want you to understand how we arrived at this moment. He scoffed. If your mind is already made up, what difference does my understanding make? I did not reply. That single remark proved he still viewed this entire process as a power struggle where apologizing meant losing. Miriam also shifted her tactics. The following morning, she called me into her bedroom, presenting a plate of sliced oranges on her side table. Sit down and have some fruit, Cora. I sat on the armchair. She paused, then spoke in a remarkably softened tone. I have been reflecting, Cora. I may have spoken too harshly the other night. I looked at her, waiting. A marriage of over 20 years should not be discarded over a few heated words, she continued. Julian has a stubborn personality. You knew that when you married him. And because I knew he was stubborn, was I required to endure his intimidation forever, Miriam? Her brow furrowed slightly. I am not saying you should endure everything. Spouses must compromise, but you have always been the more patient one. In other words, Julian was always the one entitled to demand, and I was always the one required to submit. Her frustration leaked through her gentle facade. I have humbled myself to speak with you like this, Cora. What more do you want? I remained silent. That single outburst shattered her thin veneer of reconciliation. She was not genuinely remorseful. She simply wanted me to return to my subservient role so her comfortable lifestyle could resume. I stood up. You do not need to say anything further, Miriam. Everything will proceed strictly according to the legal agreement. That afternoon, Wesley asked me to join him on the back patio. Mom, our son said quietly, Dad is extremely stressed. I looked at him gently. I know, Wesley. Are you trying to convince me to reconsider? No. Wesley answered immediately. I just wanted to make sure you are doing all right. I smiled warmly. I am doing well, sweetheart. He nodded, leaning against the railing. He resembled his father in his quiet nature. But unlike Julian, Wesley carefully weighed his words before speaking. Later that evening, I overheard father and son speaking in the living room. Julian asked, Do you think I am entirely in the wrong here, Wesley? Wesley answered carefully, I do not think it is my place to judge my parents' marriage, Dad. Then why are you not telling your mother to stop this madness? Because Mom was not the one who asked for a divorce, Dad. The room went completely silent. Wesley continued in a calm, steady voice. You have used that threat against Mom for as long as I can remember. Now that Mom finally accepted your terms, you accuse her of blowing things out of proportion. It simply is not fair, Dad. Julian snapped. What do you know about marriage? I do not know everything, Wesley replied quietly. But I know nobody forced you to sign that agreement. Standing in the kitchen, I quietly stepped away. I felt no vindication, only a deep sorrow for our children. I had spent years convincing myself that staying silent protected them, yet they had grown up fully aware of the toxic imbalance in our home. Over the following 2 weeks, Julian and I met with Attorney Mercer to finalize the separation logistics. There was no undignified brawling over television sets or dining chairs. Julian requested to retain the family's sport utility vehicle for his daily commute, and I agreed without contest. The joint savings accounts and liquid investments were distributed equitably, with Julian receiving a substantial cash offset to fully compensate for the historical funds invested in home renovations. I retained my premarital real estate, and Julian signed the formal quitclaim documentation, affirming no claim of title. He read the final settlement decree for a long time, then looked up at me with an unreadable expression. You actually credited every single renovation expense I paid. I told you from the beginning, Julian. I have no desire to take what belongs to you. He stared at me, and for the first time, I think he realized that my preparation had never been an act of vengeance. It was simply the necessary foundation to ensure that no one could ever dictate my existence again. The transition timeline proceeded smoothly. Julian secured a spacious 2-bedroom apartment near his corporate office in Stamford. He had ample financial resources, so there was no question of hardship. Miriam had her home upstate, but she chose to move into the apartment with her son, declaring that she could not leave Julian to live alone. I simply replied, I hope the transition is comfortable for you, Miriam. When we attended our final uncontested hearing before the family court judge, Julian's stern exterior showed visible cracks. When the judge asked if both parties entered into the dissolution agreement freely and voluntarily, Julian paused for 3 long seconds. I looked straight ahead. That was his final opportunity to request a stay or suggest mediation. Instead, his pride once again prevailed. Yes, Your Honor. I affirmed my consent as well. With the entry of the final divorce decree, our 20-year legal union officially came to an end. The day Julian moved his belongings was gray and overcast. He did not hire a commercial moving fleet. He rented a large van and packed several dozen cardboard boxes. Wesley assisted his father with loading books and tools, while Kendra helped her grandmother fold linens. I did not stand by with crossed arms. I brewed a pot of hot coffee and left mugs on the kitchen counter. As Miriam walked toward the front door for the last time, she stopped and looked at me. Do not blame me in the future, Cora. I met her gaze evenly. I harbor no blame toward you. Miriam. I simply refuse to live my life under the old rules. She looked away and walked down the driveway. Julian was the final person to leave the house. He stood in the entryway, looking around the living room one last time. This house holds our entire youth, Cora, he said quietly. It holds mine as well, Julian. He looked at me, a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. You truly are not going to ask me to stay? I asked you to stay for 20 years, Julian, I answered gently. I have spent enough of my life pleading. Julian stood silent. A moment later, he picked up his final duffel bag and walked out the door. I did not utter another word. The moving van pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the suburban street. Wesley drove behind them to help unload furniture at the new apartment. Kendra stood beside me on the porch, her eyes red, though she shed no tears. I walked inside and closed the front door. I did not slam it, nor did I rush to change the locks in a dramatic display of hostility. It was simply the quiet, ordinary closing of a door. Yet, as the latch clicked securely into place, the profound reality of what had occurred settled over my soul. The man who had spent 2 decades pointing toward that door, ordering me to leave, had ultimately carried his own luggage across its threshold, not because I had defeated him in a war, but because for the very first time in my life, I had refused to take a step backward. During the initial weeks following their departure, the house felt unusually quiet. There was no voice booming from the living room asking where I was going. There was no mother-in-law sitting on the patio monitoring what time I returned from work. I did not feel an overwhelming rush of triumph. I simply felt a profound, restorative peace. Wesley visited his father's apartment every weekend, often picking up arthritis supplements for his grandmother on the way. Kendra called Miriam weekly to check on her health and blood pressure. I never discouraged our children from maintaining those relationships. I told them clearly, "Your father and I are no longer husband and wife, but he will always be your father, and Miriam will always be your grandmother. Adult marital failures should never be an excuse for children to abandon their family. I refuse to weaponize my children, because in parental warfare, the children are always the ones left bleeding." Yet what Julian never anticipated was that without me acting as the permanent emotional buffer, his relationship with our adult children began to shift dramatically. One Sunday afternoon, Wesley came over for lunch and mentioned, "Dad wants me to quit my current logistics role and take an entry-level position at a firm owned by his golf acquaintance. How do you feel about that?" I asked. "I do not want to," Wesley replied. "My current salary is modest, but the leadership training and operational experience are invaluable." "Did you tell your father that?" Wesley smiled faintly. "I did." He was furious. "You are 22 years old, Wesley," I said gently. "When you make an adult decision, you take responsibility for the outcome." A few days later, Julian called me, his tone irritated. "Did you tell Wesley to reject my career advice?" I said nothing of the sort, Julian. He never used to defy my recommendations. "He made his own independent choice," I replied. Julian fell silent, then muttered, "Young people today think the moment they turn 21, they can do whatever they please." He is an adult developing his own judgment, Julian. Those are 2 very different things. Kendra experienced a similar friction. Her university department organized a week-long field study in Chicago. When Julian learned she would be traveling out of state, he immediately objected, declaring that young women should not travel unchaperoned. Kendra responded with remarkable composure, "Dad, if you have specific safety concerns, tell me so I can prepare. But this is an accredited university program, and I have already registered." Julian raised his voice. "I said no, and that is final." Kendra did not shout. "You are welcome to share your perspective, Dad, but I am an adult, and I am responsible for my own education." Upon arriving in Chicago, Kendra texted her father and grandmother to confirm her safe arrival. She was never disrespectful. She simply refused to offer blind, unthinking submission. That was what unsettled Julian the most. He had spent decades believing his children obeyed him because his authority was absolute. In truth, whenever he had lost his temper in the past, I had stepped in to soothe the children, whispering, "Just listen to your father so we can have peace." Without me serving as the household shock absorber, Julian was finally forced to learn how to communicate with 2 independent, grown adults. Miriam experienced a similar adjustment. One Friday morning, she called my personal telephone. "Cora, my knee has been acting up terribly. Could you drive me to the medical center next Tuesday?" I paused for a moment, then asked gently, "Have you spoken to Julian about this, Miriam?" "He is always buried in corporate meetings," she sighed. "Besides, you were always the one who drove me. I understood the sentiment. So many responsibilities had become assigned to me simply because I had carried them for years without complaint. If you have an urgent medical emergency, call me and I will assist," I said politely. "However, for routine checkups, please coordinate with Julian or Wesley." Since we no longer share a household, I cannot automatically manage your daily appointments. Silence fell over the line. A moment later, she muttered, "You certainly know how to draw hard lines now." That was the first time she addressed me with cold formality. I felt no anger. I am simply ensuring that responsibilities return to the people who bear them. Miriam. She hung up. Wesley drove her to the clinic that Tuesday. I realized that for decades, I had carried the delusion that if I stopped bearing every household burden, the entire structure would collapse. In reality, when one person stops carrying an unfair load, others naturally learn to shoulder their rightful share. I continued my work as director of operations. On weekends, I redecorated the downstairs guest room, installing sheer linen curtains, placing a plush reading armchair by the window, and setting up a spacious wardrobe so my mother would have a permanent place for her clothes whenever she visited. The first time my mother stayed over and saw her favorite pajamas already hanging inside the closet, she looked surprised. "Cora, why did you leave these here?" I smiled, kissing her cheek. "So that you never have to pack that tiny canvas bag again, Mom." She looked at me with tender eyes, turned toward the sunlit window, and wiped a tear from her cheek. She understood exactly what that closet meant. Several months later, Julian called my personal line. His voice lacked its customary commanding edge. "Cora, can we talk for a few minutes?" "Go ahead, Julian." He hesitated. "Do you think maybe we should give our marriage another chance?" "Why do you want to reconcile, Julian?" He let out a heavy sigh. "We were married for over 20 years. I have had time to reflect. I know I was overly harsh at times." I heard those words clearly. Overly harsh at times. What specific behavior do you consider overly harsh? Julian? Well, my temper. Speaking too aggressively. And the way I handled your mother's visit, I could have managed that with more tact. "And what about your belief that you held the right to dictate my entire life?" I asked steadily. "My career, my visits to my family, our children's choices, the rules of our home, do you recognize the issue there?" He spoke slowly. "I just wanted our household to have proper order, Cora." I had my answer. He missed the convenience of our old life, the home-cooked meals, someone tracking his mother's prescriptions, the comforting illusion that his word was law. He still called total control proper order. I asked one final question. "Julian, if this house had been titled solely in your name the night my mother visited, and you shouted at me to get out, would you have ever asked me to stay?" Dead silence fell over the line. A long time passed before Julian whispered, "Why bring that up now?" I smiled faintly into the receiver. "No reason at all. I just wanted to know if you truly understood." He offered no reply. "Take care of yourself, Julian," I said, and ended the call. I did not refuse him out of a desire to see him suffer. I never wished loneliness upon Miriam. Nor did I ever want our children to turn their backs on their father. The price Julian paid was not financial bankruptcy, catastrophic illness, or the loss of his family. He maintained his executive career, lived with his mother, and had 2 children who loved him. However, he lost the one privilege he had taken for granted for over 20 years, the power to rule through fear. When he told Wesley to change careers, his son made his own decision. When he forbade Kendra from traveling, his daughter remained polite but boarded the plane. When Miriam needed a doctor, the family managed it together without a daughter-in-law silently absorbing the strain. And as for me, the woman who once lost sleep at the mere mention of the word divorce, I continued living peacefully in my own home. I learned that seeking harmony does not mean surrendering your entire soul to purchase a counterfeit peace. Spouses should compromise out of mutual love, but a partner's patience should never be used as a permanent license for tyranny. A marriage endures through mutual respect, not through one partner issuing decrees while the other lives in terror of abandonment.